Chapter 459. Emo Chinga suddenly looked up at the foot of the mountain. "What's wrong?" Qingxi asked. "Look." She pointed at the entrance of the space crack. "Did someone go out?" Qingxi concentrated. They were a bit far away, so his divine sense couldn't detect that direction. However, with his eyes, he seemed to see flashes of light at the entrance from time to time. Except for the half an hour when it was open, no one came in or out of the entrance. It seemed that someone had left. Indeed, it's only been 3 days. Emo Chinga frowned and said slowly, "This spiritual mountain is so big. 3 days shouldn't be enough for them to search for treasures." How many spiritual treasures were there in this space crack? How could a nascent soul cultivator be willing to leave after 3 days? Maybe they have other reasons? Qingxi guessed. Emo Chinga thought for a while, then shook her head. "I don't know." She then smiled and said, "Let's talk about it later. No matter what their plan is, we have our own purpose." Qingxi answered softly, then turned to look ahead. "Let's go. If there are no accidents, we still need one more day." After walking through the canyon burning with earth pole real fire, they were already halfway up the mountain. In just 1 day they had already traveled more than half the distance. They didn't encounter anything too dangerous on the way, and instead they picked up some spiritual treasures. Their journey was extremely smooth. After leaving the canyon, they took a long detour to avoid a mass of primordial devil aura and then came to a forest. Although it was called a forest, it wasn't actually a tree but some thick vines. Their roots were intertwined like trees. Emo Chinga looked at the scene in front of her and unconsciously frowned. She seemed to have seen this before. "This is a blood-eating vine," Fu Yaozi said to her with his divine comprehension. "This kind of vine feeds on living things and devours flesh and blood, so it's full of spiritual aura. However, spiritual beasts also like to eat it to increase their cultivation level. If you raise a spiritual beast, it's really a great tonic. If you eat enough of it, you'll advance faster." Emo Chinga looked at it and suddenly remembered that when she went to the East Sea, she saw blood-eating vines on a small island. At that time, Xiaohua ate a lot of them. Later, she chopped some of them and left them in the virtual sky world. Xiaohua treasured those vines and stored them in its nest. It only ate a little every once in a while, and it took a long time for it to finish them all. Thinking up to this point, she took out her flying sword and said to Qingxi, "Let's chop some to take back." Qingxi couldn't hear the conversation between her and Fu Yaozi, so he was puzzled. "Why would I chop them back? Does this thing have any special use?" Emo Chinga relayed Fu Yaozi's words to him. Qingxi's interest was also piqued. Before she left, Emo Chinga left a lot of medicinal pills at Shenqing School. His bright bird advanced to the 7th rank because of them. If this blood-eating vine really had that kind of effect, maybe it could help his bright bird advance to the 8th rank. At that time, his strength would be greatly enhanced. Rank 8 spirit beasts were definitely not easy to raise. Once they were promoted to rank 8, they would gain spiritual intelligence. Even a spirit beast contract would be difficult to restrain them, unless the spirit beast egg recognized them as its master. However, spirit beasts had a long lifespan and advanced slowly. Even if a cultivator successfully cultivated to the nascent soul realm, by the time he passed away, the spirit beast might only be in the 5th or 6th rank. Therefore, a nascent soul cultivator with an 8th rank spirit beast was equivalent to having a nascent soul helper compared to other cultivators. Their strength could be imagined. That old Donkey Ma, an individual cultivator in the late nascent soul realm, was a good example. Emo Chinga's flying sword chopped the thick vine. She felt her spiritual aura tremble, and with a whoosh, a vine rolled towards her. She dodged sideways and controlled her flying sword to chop the same spot again. After doing this several times, she finally chopped the vine. This vine was even tougher than the one she encountered on the small island in the Eastern Sea. However, her cultivation level had improved greatly these past few years, so it wasn't as hard to deal with as before. Upon seeing this, Qingxi pointed with his spiritual aura. A sword light separated from the sword formation and flew towards the vine with a whistling sound. When the sword light passed by, the vine was chopped. Seeing this, Emo Chinga was discouraged. "I've been chopping so hard, but you've only done this." Qingxi smiled. Metal and fire are the nemesis of the wood attribute. Besides, his cultivation level wasn't just for show. How could it be the same? He said again, Haven't you gotten used to it? You can just call me for this kind of thing. This isn't relying on me, it's just that each industry has its own specialization." Emo Chinga was stunned. She glanced at him and was speechless. He was right. She had to get used to it. When the two of them were together, some things didn't have to be done by herself. Obviously, it was easier for him to do it, so she just let him do it. In any case, it was a fact that he was stronger now, and she also had her own strengths. It's about time. After chopping almost half of the blood-eating vines, she finally stopped and put all the vines into a chinkuan bag. There's a demonic beast. Emochinga seemed to have sensed something just as she put the blood-eating vines away. She turned her head and was startled. She looked up and his expression changed. He instantly withdrew his sword aura and circled around the two of them. Not far from them, a demonic beast spread its wings and flew over. It circled around the blood-eating vine forest and looked at them. On a certain precipice on Mount Lingshan, Scholar Yu was frowning as he carefully studied the words carved on the wall. The two early-stage nascent soul cultivators from Yu Mountain Academy who entered this space with him, as well as Han Shizhi's group of 3, were also carefully searching or recording on the precipice. Han Shizhi held the nameless list in his hand and compared it one by one. He then slowly wrote something on it with the golden brush magic weapon in his hand. After a long time, he heaved a sigh of relief and said respectfully, "Teacher, I finished recording." Scholar Yu answered, but his gaze still didn't move away. He continued to stare for a while, then beckoned Han Shizhi. "Shizhi, come here." "Yes." Han Shizhi flew to Scholar Yu's side. Scholar Yu pointed at a line of words on the precipice and asked, "Do you recognize this kind of words?" Han Shizhi's gaze fell on the direction Scholar Yu was pointing at with his folding fan. A hesitant expression appeared on his face. After thinking for a long time, he finally said, "I think these words are a bit familiar. They're very similar to Jin Yuan from the Middle Ages era, but they're not the same." Scholar Yu showed a satisfied smile. "You're really well read. These words must have evolved from Jin Yuan. Although we still can't understand them at the moment, we'll definitely understand the meaning given time." He paused for a while, then said, "I don't know what expert cast a brilliant spell on this precipice, but this passage of words can only be read and can't be copied. All of you memorize it. I hope we can restore it from memory after we leave this place." "Yes," the two nascent soul cultivators and Han Shizhi answered. While the other 3 were memorizing the words on the precipice, Scholar Yu's gaze fell on the Immortal Palace. The nameless list was one of the 5 sacred objects passed down by Teacher Zhou. Everyone else thought this object was the same as the other 4 sacred objects, a top-grade spiritual treasure, but in fact it wasn't. It was just an ordinary book, but it recorded an extraordinary cultivation method. This cultivation method was incomplete and nameless. It was written down by Teacher Zhou based on his memory after he returned from the spatial rift in the Sea of Returning Ruins. Teacher Zhou wrote down his past experiences behind the nameless list. This cultivation method was obtained from the precipice of Mount Spirited in the spatial rift. However, an expert had cast a mysterious spell on the precipice. When one read it, they would only feel that every word was clear, but when they turned their heads, they would find that their minds were empty, unable to memorize it in the book. Only by continuously memorizing it would they be able to retain some of it in their minds. Although it was only an incomplete cultivation method, and even the words in it couldn't be completely deciphered, the incomplete content was enough to drive these Confucian cultivators crazy. Their most important goal was to find the complete cultivation method when the spatial rift opened this time. As for the Immortal Palace, that was naturally one of their goals. However, Scholar Yu knew that with that Fox Yuan Mu around, it would be impossible for the Yu Mountain Academy to obtain the greatest benefits. Instead of wasting their efforts, they might as well focus on completing the nameless list. As for the opportunity to become a soul formation cultivator, he naturally had to fight for it. However, he also had to leave a backup plan. Half a day later, Han Shizhi finally stopped memorizing and looked at Scholar Yu. "Teacher, I've memorized it." Scholar Yu's gaze was drawn back from the Immortal Palace, and he said approvingly, "Shizhi, you're indeed the most outstanding junior in the academy. No wonder Teacher Zhou would choose you as the master of the nameless list." "Teacher, you flatter me," Han Shizhi said modestly without a hint of arrogance on his face. Scholar Yu smiled faintly, opened his folding fan and suddenly asked, "Shizhi, judging from your expression, do you have any doubts?" Han Shizhi paused for a moment, then said bluntly, "That's right, I do have some doubts in my heart. I hope teacher can enlighten me." "Hee." Scholar Yu laughed softly and said, "I know what you want to ask. Actually, with your intelligence and wisdom, you can be called the #1 junior in the Yu Mountain Academy. However you..." He paused for a moment, then continued, "Sometimes being too smart will cause you to overlook other possibilities." Han Shizhi paused for a moment, then bowed and asked, "I don't understand, teacher, please enlighten me." Scholar Yu smiled and said, Then let me ask you, we Confucians stand on the path of righteousness. Why do you want to take an unconventional path? Han Shiji frowned slightly, but his expression was still respectful as he replied, I believe that the so-called Tao is the heart, and the so-called right and wrong are also the heart. If the heart believes that there is no wrong, then it is the right path. The righteousness of Confucianism accepts the right and wrong of our predecessors, so there is a distinction between good and evil. However, I see right and wrong with my heart, so I'm also righteous, but I'm neither good nor evil. Scholar Yu smiled and said, in short, your right and wrong are only related to yourself, and have nothing to do with others. Han Shiji nodded without hesitation, exactly. The first sentence was almost equivalent to denying the ancient Confucian morality. However, Scholar Yu didn't seem to blame him and still said in a gentle and refined manner, Shiji, you've comprehended all this, which means that you're an extremely self-centered person. This isn't bad, there's not much difference between an extreme ego and absolute persistence, and persistence is a necessary condition for success. However, have you ever thought that your ego would make you overly greedy? Han Shiji was stunned, looking at Scholar Yu, and didn't speak for a long time. Scholar Yu smiled and said, after entering this space, everyone has their own thoughts. Yuan Mu is like that, Wu Ming is like that, and that Guifang is also like that. I don't believe that they would bet all their treasures on the so-called immortal palace. Is the so-called fate of immortals really worth risking our lives for? I'm afraid not. Chapter 460. At the top of the spiritual mountain, beside the immortal palace, the cultivators of Juyin sect sat cross-legged and focused on adjusting their breaths. There weren't many cultivators left in Juyin sect. 2 late-stage nascent soul cultivators, 3 middle-stage nascent soul cultivators, and Ling Yunhe, a junior in the late-stage core formation realm. The group of 6 didn't have the advantage in numbers among the cultivators who came to search for treasures. However, their cultivation levels were outstanding, so they were still the strongest team. At this moment, they were seizing the opportunity to cultivate before the others arrived at the immortal palace. The spiritual aura on the top of the spiritual mountain next to the immortal palace was abundant. Even the top-grade spirit veins in Yunzhong couldn't compare to it, so it was a rare opportunity. Ling Yunhe once asked Ling Xiyu out of curiosity, with such abundant spiritual aura in this space, wouldn't it be easier to make a realm breakthrough here? Ling Xiyu answered. That was true, but who would dare to do that? The most important thing for high-level cultivators to make realm breakthroughs wasn't the abundance of spiritual aura, but safety. With so many cultivators entering this place, where could they find a reliable immortal's cave for closed-door meditation? This wasn't their own territory, so there were too many variables. They're coming. Master Taoist Yuanmu suddenly moved and opened his eyes. Hearing the sound, the others stopped meditating and looked into the distance. 2 flight lights crossed the dense forest and appeared on the pure white snow, quickly approaching the immortal palace. 1 flight light was white and the other was red. The white one was pure and the red one was dazzling. There were also hundreds of sharp sword auras surrounding them, preventing the 10,000-year-old snow fog from approaching them. It's them? Ling Xiyu raised his eyebrows. With his divine sense, he had already distinguished that they were a nascent soul cultivator and a core formation cultivator. Among the cultivators who entered this space, only one party had such a combination. That fellow Taoist Mo really can't be underestimated. Ling Yunhe muttered to himself while looking at the 2 flight lights. He could see that the nascent soul cultivator didn't deliberately slow down. Under such circumstances, the flight light of the core formation cultivator still easily kept up with his speed. Even if they used the same flying magic weapon, she still needed to be very strong. Master Taoist Iron Mask, who had been silent, suddenly said, Yunhe, do you know what spiritual roots that female cultivator has and what cultivation technique she practices? Ling Yunhe was slightly startled. He bowed and answered, Martial Uncle Tai Mian, disciple doesn't know. However, she once made a deal with disciple in exchange for Danxia sect's Art of Sunu. Art of Sunu? Master Taoist Yuanmu narrowed his eyes. Could it be that she's... Ling Yunhe knew what he wanted to say next and said, Martial Uncle Yuanmu, disciple thinks that if she really has a pure Yin constitution, her actions are too bold. Plus, she's only a core formation cultivator, how could she hide from all of you? Not necessarily. Perfected Yunmu shook his head. This woman is courageous and insightful. She also has many numinous treasures on her. She might even dare to do so. She sighed again. What a pity. She already has a dual cultivation Tao companion, and her primordial Yin has already been lost. Even if that's the case, she doesn't have much value anymore. Heh, Junior Martial Brother Yuan Mu, enlightened Master Iron Mask said, it's not important whether this woman has a pure constitution or not. What I find strange is why is her flight light white? Master Taoist Yuan Mu's expression turned serious. He looked at Master Iron Mask and said, Senior Martial Brother, you mean, a white flight light? This person either had some kind of fortuitous encounter or has a mixed spiritual root with all 5 elements. Junior Martial Brother, which one do you think it's? Master Taoist Yuan Mu's expression gradually turned solemn. A white flight light represented the integration of all 5 elements. If one didn't have spiritual roots with all 5 elements, then the cultivation technique they practiced must also have 5 elements. In the cultivation world, choosing cultivation techniques based on one spiritual root was one of the laws. People without metal spiritual roots couldn't practice metal attribute cultivation techniques. If a special situation occurred, it meant that this person had an extremely great fated chance and broke through the laws. Since it was called a law, how could it be so easy to change? This fated chance was no small matter. If it was the second case, the reason why white flight lights were rarely seen was because cultivators with 5 spiritual roots were mostly stuck in the early stage of the aura refining realm for the rest of their lives. Only cultivators in the foundation building realm and above could fly. Among cultivators with 5 spiritual roots, only 1 in 10,000 could reach the foundation building realm, let alone the core formation realm. This woman was in the peak stage of the core formation realm, only 1 step away from the nascent soul realm. Master Taoist Iron Mask continued, I once saw a record in a predecessor's notebook. In the past, I only thought it was a rumor and didn't take it seriously. Now it seems that it might be true. He looked at Master Taoist Yuan Mu. That number 1 person in Yunzhong, Senior Fu Yaozi, has a mixed spiritual root with all 5 elements. Master Taoist Yuan Mu narrowed his eyes and looked sharply at Master Taoist Iron Mask. Really? No expression could be seen on Master Taoist Iron Mask's black iron mask, and his voice was also flat. That's right. After pondering for a long time, Master Taoist Yuan Mu let out a long sigh and said, if this matter succeeds, we'll try our best to rope them in. If it fails, we absolutely can't let them take 1 step out of Immortal Palace. Although he didn't say why, the people present weren't ordinary people. They immediately understood what he meant and agreed in a low voice. The Fuxing sword recognized Fu Yaozi as its master. It turned out that they had something in common. That meant, this female cultivator was very likely to have inherited Fu Yaozi's teachings. Although they weren't afraid of Fu Yaozi as the number 1 cultivator in Yunzhong, there had to be something special about her. From what they saw, this female cultivator was both courageous and not stupid. Who could say for sure what kind of achievements she could achieve in the future? If what they wanted succeeded, it would be a good thing to be on good terms with her. But if it didn't, they were afraid she'd bear a grudge against them for scheming against her. At that time, to avoid making enemies for Jian sect, they could only eliminate her to avoid future troubles. While they were thinking, 2 flight lights approached Immortal Palace at an extremely fast speed. Several hundred flashing sword lights parted the snow fog. A man and a woman arrived in front of them in an instant. Ling Yunhe noticed that under Mo Chenga's feet, there was a faint glow from her boots. She wasn't using a flying magic weapon with Qin Shi. The cultivation technique he cultivated was very sensitive to the aura of spiritual treasures. Right now he was sure she flew all the way with her own ability. He sighed inwardly. The anger in his heart gradually calmed down. As it turned out, he was actually inferior to her. That being the case, why should he take it to heart? Seniors, you're early, Mo Chenga said with a smile. Together with Qin Shi, she greeted them. Master Taoist Yuan Mu showed a flat smile. He said neither warmly nor coldly, you 2 aren't late either. It's only been 4 days but you've already arrived. You didn't stop on the way, right? Mo Chenga put on a fake smile. We husband and wife are weak and don't have the ability to covet anything. We can only rely on our fated chances on the way. Fortunately, our journey was smooth. We picked up some treasures and encountered a 9th-ranked demonic beast. A 9th-ranked demonic beast? Although they looked calm, a hint of surprise flashed in the eyes of Master Taoist Yuan Mu and the others. There weren't many demonic beasts in this spiritual mountain, but if one appeared occasionally, it would be above the 8th rank. They had the advantage in numbers, so they weren't afraid. A 9th-ranked demonic beast was equivalent to a middle-stage nascent soul cultivator. The demonic beasts in this space lived and cultivated in places full of spiritual aura or turbulent devil aura all year round, so they were much stronger than those in the outside world. Not only did the 2 of them look uninjured, but they also didn't look the least bit disheveled. This kind of strength really couldn't be underestimated. So, fellow Taoist killed that demonic beast? Master Taoist Yuanmu asked. Qin Shi smiled faintly and said, I was just lucky. Fellow Taoist Qin is too modest. Master Taoist Yuanmu smiled and said politely, you and your wife are amazing. Even I wasn't completely sure about dealing with the 9th-ranked demonic beast here, but judging from your appearances, you killed it very easily. It seems it's really a blessing to have your help on this trip to Immortal Palace. You flatter me. Qin Shi responded. Listening to their conversation and looking at Master Taoist Yuanmu's current attitude, Mo Chenga laughed inwardly. Sure enough, she had to show a bit of her strength appropriately. Not long ago, she didn't even have the qualifications to talk about conditions in front of this Master Taoist Yuanmu. But now, with Qin Shi next to her and his extraordinary strength, this Master Taoist Yuanmu was a lot more polite. Fellow Taoist Ling, the others haven't arrived yet? Mo Chenga asked Ling Yunhe while Qin Shi was talking to the nascent soul cultivators from Juyin sect. After all, there was a gap between their cultivation levels, so it was better to ask Ling Yunhe about some things. Ling Yunhe laughed and said, after entering this space, how many people are willing to part with the spiritual treasures on the way? They should still be looking for treasures, right? Mo Chenga blinked. Previously, Ling Yunhe always looked like he wanted to say something to her, but today he was so relaxed. Thinking this, she didn't show any abnormalities on her face and said with a smile, then what about fellow Taoist Ling? Are you and your masters willing to part with them? Ling Yunhe shook his head and cast a glance at the foot of the mountain. Fellow Taoist Mo, haven't you noticed that we're short of people? To tell you the truth, my martial uncles have gone to look for treasures under orders. It's just that martial uncle Yuanmu thinks the immortal fate in Immortal Palace is a big matter, so the spiritual treasures should be looked for by those martial uncles. It's more important for us to take care of business. Oh. This also made sense. After all, there were many people from Juyin sect, and they were the only ones who could divide their forces into 2 groups and ensure that the strength of both groups wasn't bad. By the way, fellow Taoist Mo just encountered a 9th-ranked demonic beast. I wonder how strong it was. We only saw one. That demonic beast saw that we had a lot of people, so it ran far away. While Ling Yunhe and Mo Chenga were chatting, the several nascent soul cultivators were exchanging pointers with Qin Shi. More than half a day later, some figures finally appeared in the white snow. A group of monks wearing monk robes and straw shoes, chanting Buddha's name on a lotus platform, hurried over. It was Venerable Avidya and Venerable Xuxiang. Everyone stood up. Master Taoist Yuanmu already went to greet them. Fellow Taoist Avidya, you're finally here. He still didn't pay any attention to Venerable Xuxiang. Venerable Xuxiang also didn't care. Instead, he rushed to shout, Old man Yuanmu, why did you come so early? There were a lot of natural treasures on the way. You're actually willing to part with them? Master Taoist Yuanmu humphed and said, I just arrived a little earlier than you. It's only been less than 5 days. You're really willing to part with them? No matter how good the natural treasures are, they're not as important as a fated chance in the deification realm, right? I don't have a key. If I came late, wouldn't I be unable to enter? Master Taoist Yuanmu gave him a supercilious look and ignored him. Mo Chenga had already seen him before. This Venerable Xuxiang didn't have the demeanor of a great late-stage nascent soul cultivator. He talked nonsense and said everything. Most late-stage nascent soul cultivators didn't like to talk to him, and even the slick and smooth Master Taoist Yuanmu was no exception. Venerable Avidya chuckled and came out to smooth things over. Fellow Taoist Yuanmu, you're really early. Fellow Taoist Qin, little friend Mo, you're also here. Chapter 461. Within a day or two, all the late-stage nascent soul cultivators arrived one after another, and the side of the Immortal Palace gradually became lively. Apart from them, the other middle-stage and early-stage nascent soul cultivators who entered the space didn't show up. This phenomenon was very normal. On one hand, although Master Taoist Yuanmu and the others invited them to enter the space, they had to rely on their own abilities to reach the Immortal Palace. There was no lack of dangerous places on Mount Lingshan, so some of them couldn't make it in time. On the other hand, there were spiritual treasures everywhere outside the Immortal Palace, so it was normal that many cultivators didn't want to get involved because there was a world of difference between the early stage and the late stage of the nascent soul realm. Although Master Taoist Yuanmu was usually kind, he wouldn't care about ordinary early-stage nascent soul cultivators or even middle-stage nascent soul cultivators attacking him together. They didn't have to wait too long. On the 6th day, Scholar Yu and the other cultivators from Yu Mountain Academy finally arrived. After some discussion, they decided to enter the Immortal Palace. At this time, apart from the late-stage nascent soul cultivators and their fellow disciples, only a few middle-stage and early-stage nascent soul cultivators had arrived. Little friend Mo, can you tell us how to open this Immortal Palace? In the deal with Yuan Mu and the others, Mo Chinga's bargaining chip was the method to obtain the immortal fate and the specific path. Because the power of the holy objects left by the other 4-5 saints had declined, they didn't pass down all of their contents. This was also one of the reasons Yuan Mu and the others had to agree with her. Mo Chinga nodded with a smile. Of course. Then she looked up at Ling Yunha and the others and said, "Fellow Taoists, please come here." The 4 of them glanced at their respective masters. After receiving instructions, they walked over. Mo Chinga took out a jade slip from her Qingquan bag. The ancient restrictions on this immortal palace are very powerful. Back then, the 5 saints worked together but only came up with a method to temporarily open a passage. This passageway could only exist for 3 days. After 3 days, it would not be easy to open the passageway again. This is the jade slip recording the method. You should memorize it first. The first to take the jade slip was Ling Yunha. He took it without hesitation and probed it with his divine sense. After a while, he passed the jade slip to the next person. Next were Jiewu, Han Shizhi, and Yang Qingji. When the 4 of them finished reading, Mo Chinga asked, "Do the 4 of you need some time to familiarize yourselves with this place?" Before the others could answer, Jiewu chuckled and said, "Benefactor Mo, this humble monk's aptitude is mediocre. I'm afraid I won't be able to grasp it in a short time and ruin Senior's plans. Please give me an hour to familiarize myself with the technique." Mo Chinga smiled and nodded. "Then we'll start in an hour." Since Jiewu said so, the others didn't say anything else. They each found a place to meditate, silently recited the incantation, and began to adjust their breathing. Tinga. She was a bit worried when he saw Mo Chinga coming back. This method? Don't worry, it'll be fine. Mo Chinga knew what he wanted to say. The strength of this immortal palace's restriction was obvious to everyone. Breaking this kind of restriction would most likely require a great deal of power. The 5 of them were only core formation cultivators. If they suffered a backlash, they would certainly lose their lives immediately. They simply couldn't withstand that kind of power. However, it will be a little troublesome to enter. After pondering for a moment, she said, "I originally planned to borrow their strength to protect myself, but now that you're here, what's wrong? Is there a problem?" Mo Chinga glanced at the few late nascent soul cultivators and middle-stage cultivators around her and said, "I don't know if your sword formation can block the dangers inside the passage. You don't have to worry too much about this." Fu Yaozi's voice suddenly rang in her head. This senior martial brother's natal magic weapon should be a spiritual treasure inherited from the distant past era. It's been nourished by his blood essence for a long time, so its power is extraordinary. Furthermore, he practiced body-refining techniques, so passing through the passage shouldn't be a problem. "But Master, what about me?" "Ha." Fu Yaozi chuckled. "Did you forget what Master asked you to buy? Your meridians are strong, and together with the protective talismans I asked you to prepare, there shouldn't be any problems." "Tinga?" She called her again when he saw that she didn't answer for a long time. "It's all right. Master Fu Yaozi told me." "Oh." She was actually very curious. He knew there was a powerful divine sense on Fuxing's sword, but he never communicated with it. Sometimes when he listened to Mo Chinga's narration, he yearned for it even more. He wondered what kind of amazing cultivator the divine sense on the sword belonged to. An hour later, Ling Yunha and the others stopped adjusting their breaths. Everyone looked at Ju Wu, but he was still meditating with his eyes closed, concentrating on chanting. After waiting for a while, he finally breathed a sigh of relief and opened his eyes. He clasped his hands in front of his chest apologetically and said to Mo Chinga, "Benefactor Mo, I'm done." Mo Chinga nodded, then stood up and walked to the center. She then took out several formation discs from her robe and laid them outside the Immortal Palace's gate. All the nascent soul cultivators stared at her movements attentively. They were all very curious. Even with their cultivation levels, they couldn't see through the restrictions on the Immortal Palace. How could a core formation cultivator crack them, even with Fu Yaozi's guidance? Whoosh! The last formation flag fell, and the formation disc instantly shone with a white light. With a clear sound, a star chart appeared on the ground. Upon seeing this, Scholar Yu narrowed his eyes. He was knowledgeable and had dabbled in the Tao of formations, but he actually couldn't see through the mysteries of the formation she had set up. The 5 sages were indeed the 5 sages. Although he was now a late-stage nascent soul cultivator and was slightly stronger than the 5 sages from back then, he still couldn't see through the formation the 5 sages had set up. Seniors, Mo Chenga said loudly to Yuan Mu and the others, our cultivation levels aren't high enough, so we still need you to protect us. If any of us doesn't have enough spiritual aura, please lend us a helping hand. Of course, Master Taoist Yuan Mu said, little friend Mo doesn't need to worry about this. Mo Chenga smiled. This was related to the opening of the Immortal Palace, so she expected they'd all do their best. She turned around and said to Ling Yunha and the others, fellow Taoists, let's start. The 4 of them nodded, stood at the 5 corners of the formation, and took out their holy objects. Just like how they used to open the space, the 5 of them chanted an incantation. With a buzzing sound, the 5 holy objects each emitted a white light. However, this time, the powerful spiritual aura exploded from the 5 holy objects and poured into the formation under their feet with the 5 of them as the mediators. Mo Chenga frowned, enduring the pain caused by the powerful spiritual aura passing through her meridians. She had gone through the 5 spirits cultivation technique, so her meridians were strong, so this kind of pain wasn't unbearable. However, the other 4 weren't so lucky. Different degrees of pain appeared on their faces, especially Yang Qingji and Ju Wu. Their cultivation levels were the lowest, so they suffered the most. All the nascent soul cultivators stared at the 5 of them, and Guifeng Devil Monarch and Revered Avidya looked even more concerned. Seeing that the aura from the holy objects was getting weaker and weaker, and their faces were getting paler and paler, Master Taoist Yuan Mu took a step forward and hit Ling Yunha with his palm. As soon as he moved, Revered Avidya and the others immediately stepped forward. Master Taoist Iron Mask from Juyin sect looked at Qin Shi and asked, fellow Taoist Qin, do you need me to do it for you? The other 4 all had elders in the late stage of the nascent soul realm. Only Mo Chenga and Qin Shi were in the middle stage of the nascent soul realm, and they seemed to have just advanced to the middle stage. Qin Shi shook his head and cupped his hands at him. Fellow Taoist, I appreciate your kindness. After he finished speaking, he took a step forward and also hit Mo Chenga. The cultivation technique they practiced was yin and yang, so in the process of transferring spiritual aura, they didn't consume much and benefited a lot. Master Taoist Iron Mask didn't know about this. He only thought Qin Shi was worried, so he didn't insist. With a nascent soul cultivator continuously transferring spiritual aura, the 5 of them finally looked a lot better. As time passed, the formation under their feet became brighter and brighter. Eventually, the light from the holy objects slowly faded, and the formation emitted a dazzling light as if it had eaten its fill of spiritual aura. In the light, a dark hole the size of a person appeared. The cultivators were overjoyed when they saw the entrance. Mo Chenga breathed a sigh of relief. It was finally done. Seniors, she said loudly, Junior has to remind you that this passage is very dangerous. If you don't have a powerful defensive magic weapon, please be careful when you enter. Little friend Mo, rest assured, Master Taoist Yuan Mu said faintly, you've all become great nascent soul cultivators, so you all understand this principle. Fated chances all depend on fate. Even if you die here, you can't blame others. Exactly. How could we not understand what little friend Mo understands? Revered Avidya smiled. Little friend Mo, you said before, are we going together? Mo Chenga smiled. The condition of her previous deal was to tell them how to find fated chances to become immortals. Opening the Immortal Palace was only the first step. With their mutual trust, these people wouldn't believe her words and would definitely want her to go with them lest she schemed against them. Of course, but... She glanced at the cultivators around her. There were so many people here. Aside from the 3 clans who negotiated the conditions, there were also many late-stage nascent soul cultivators. She couldn't afford to offend them. In the end, Master Taoist Yuan Mu said loudly, fellow Taoists, Mr. Yu and fellow Taoist Avidya invited you to explore the secret place together. Now we've fulfilled our promise. Once we enter this passage, we'll search for fated chances to become immortals based on our own abilities. What do you think? Old Yuan Mu, why are you talking so much nonsense? We old guys have lived for so many years. Don't tell me we don't even understand these principles? Alright, you've already done your best. Whether we can enter or not, whether we can find it or not, it's all fate. Who would blame you? Revered Avidya waved his hand impatiently. He looked like a boorish man, but after living for so long and cultivating to the late stage of the nascent soul realm, how could he not see it? They had holy objects in their hands, so there must be some secrets that they wouldn't share with others. Meowing progenitor said with a smile, fellow Taoist Avidya is right. Fellow Taoist Yuanmu, we don't have much time. Let's not waste it. Master Taoist Yuanmu nodded and said, if that's the case, I won't be polite. Juyin sect will go first. Does anyone have any objections? Juyin sect had holy objects and was the strongest, so the others naturally wouldn't have any objections. The 5 nascent soul cultivators of Juyin sect each used their own methods and released their magic weapons to protect the cloud-soaring crane as they entered the passage first. After them were the 3 nascent soul cultivators of Yu Mountain Academy and Han Shizhi, followed by Guifeng Devil Monarch and Yang Qingji. Before entering the passage, revered Avidya turned to Mo Chenga and Qin Shi and put his palms together. Fellow Taoist Qin, do you too want to go with us? After entering this space, there were several early-stage nascent soul cultivators from Huayan Temple. Right now, none of them were here, so revered Avidya was the only one who seemed enlightened. Qin Shi glanced at Mo Chenga. When he saw her nodding, he smiled and said, since Master has sincerely invited us, we'll accept it. Chapter 462. Protective Spiritual Talismans, White Silk Handkerchief, Art of the Origin, all kinds of defensive methods were used. By the time Mo Chenga finished her preparations, Qin Shi had already summoned his 3-yang real fire sword, transforming it into a sword aura formation. He also used a spiritual talisman. Venerable Avidya and Enlightened were much simpler. Their Buddhist cultivation techniques included body refining techniques. At this moment, Venerable Avidya chanted the name of Buddha and flicked the prayer beads in front of his chest. A pure and holy Buddhist light bloomed from his fingers and surrounded the 4 of them. Qin Shi cupped his hands and bowed to Venerable Avidya. Thank you, Master. Venerable Avidya smiled. His eyes were still closed and his expression was kind. Mo Chenga knew the reason the other party acted like this was most likely because of the inescapable net incident. He wanted to return the favor. Venerable Avidya said enlightened cultivated Zen. She didn't know much about Buddhist cultivators, but judging from his words he should be a relatively gentle Buddhist cultivator. Venerable Avidya's way of doing things was also different from those selfish cultivators. Aside from protecting himself, he didn't hesitate to help others. Thinking about it this way, if there was no fundamental conflict of interests, the 2 of them would be good partners. After setting up several defensive methods, the 4 of them walked into the passage one by one. As soon as they entered the passage, all the light seemed to be swallowed in an instant. There was nothing except the faint light emitted by the 3-yang real fire sword and the protective aura shield. In the darkness, Mo Chenga felt her hand tighten. It was Qin Shi holding her hand tightly. He whispered, be careful not to get separated. She felt warmth in her heart and responded with a smile. This passage wasn't the transporting formation at the entrance. Instead, it was a special space created by temporarily breaking the restrictions with the power of the formation. In real space, the 2 ends of the passage might be separated by a door, but in this passage they might have to walk a long way. In other words, this was also a space crack created by tearing space, independent of the outside world. Tearing space. This definitely wasn't a spell that existed in the modern cultivation world. Only the cultivators of the Middle Ages knew this kind of great void-shattering divine ability. Because of this, no matter how knowledgeable scholar you was, he couldn't see the mystery of Mo Chenga's formation. Of course, the activation technique used by the 5 saints back then was not the real void-stomping technique. Truly crushing the void and tearing the space apart was similar to the virtual sky world, which created an independent and stable space that formed a cycle of its own, just like a small world. As for this restriction-breaking formation, the spatial tearing technique it used was only the tip of the iceberg. The space it created was unstable and filled with danger. Furthermore, it could only be maintained for a short period of time. However, for the current cultivation world, this kind of method was already a shocking magical power. This was an incomplete spell that Fu Yaozi had obtained from an ancient cultivator's cave. It was also the reason why he was able to obtain the greatest opportunity in the Immortal Palace. Not long after they entered the passage they heard sounds. Mo Chenga turned around and saw that the drifting restrictions outside were hitting everyone's defensive barriers. Qin Shi furrowed his brows and said softly, what a powerful restriction. If our defensive methods weren't good enough, I'm afraid it would have been broken. Revered Avidya, who was sitting on the Lotus platform in front of them, laughed and said, fellow Taoist Qin sword formation is very powerful. This old monk has underestimated it. Master, you're too polite. Qin Shi smiled. If it weren't for Master's help, I wouldn't have it so easy. As soon as the two of them finished talking, they saw the Buddha light barrier outside shaking. Revered Avidya paused for a moment, then pinched the Buddha beads in his hand. Buddha's light appeared faintly on his hand, and the barrier immediately stabilized. Qinshi didn't stay out of this. He pointed with his spiritual aura, and his sword aura turned into thousands of sword lights, covering the barrier. Although Mo Qingge and Ju Wu weren't directly attacked inside the barrier, they both felt the pressure from the restrictions outside. The spiritual aura pressure in the darkness passed through the outermost Buddha light and sword lights. This invisible pressure directly suppressed their primordial spirits, making them unconsciously turn pale. Upon realizing this, Mo Qingge silently operated the soul refining art. Her soul refining art had already reached the third layer. If she used it with all her strength, the spiritual aura pressure she emitted would far surpass that of cultivators in the same realm as her. Now that she operated it, she immediately felt the pressure lighten. Little friend Mo's secret techniques are really amazing. No wonder you dared to come all the way to Yunzhong alone and even bargain with us old guys. Revered Avidya's voice came. Mo Qingge was stunned and couldn't help but feel a bit helpless. This old monk usually closed his eyes to make others think he was blind, but in the end he didn't even turn his head. He could even clearly sense her using the soul refining art. His Buddhist name really shouldn't be Avidya, it should be Tai Ming. Although she thought that way, she still politely replied, "Senior, you flatter me. Junior only obtained these secret techniques by chance and by being a bit diligent." Hee hee. Revered Avidya chuckled. Well said. Aren't fated chances and diligent factors essential to becoming a great cultivator? Little friend has fated chances and knows how to be diligent. Seeing that you have such a cultivation level at such a young age, your comprehension and aptitude must be good. Your future is really boundless. Mo Qingge felt a bit embarrassed after being praised like this. Junior doesn't deserve Senior's praise. Compared to a great cultivator like Senior, Junior hasn't even reached the nascent soul realm yet. In this old monk's opinion, little friend will advance to the nascent soul realm soon, right? Revered Avidya said calmly, maybe before this old monk passes away, I'll be able to see little friend become a late-stage great cultivator. Today I'll also form a good karma for the disciples of Huayan Temple. Mo Qingge thought this Revered Avidya was really far-sighted. Although she believed she could advance to the nascent soul realm, she didn't dare to think about becoming a late-stage nascent soul cultivator. After all, the path of cultivation after the nascent soul realm was much more difficult than cultivating to the nascent soul realm. She never expected this Revered Avidya would think so highly of her and use his status as a late-stage nascent soul cultivator to form a good karma with her. It was her own mistake to overlook this. She was only a core formation cultivator, and even if she advanced to the nascent soul realm, she was nothing in the eyes of a top cultivator in the human realm like Revered Avidya. However, she had Qinshi by her side. Not only was he her Tao companion now, but he was also her senior martial brother. Since her sect could cultivate a great cultivator like Qinshi, it must also be a big sect in the outer endless sea, so it was worth it for him to form a good karma with her. After all, although Huayan Temple was a big Buddhist sect, it wasn't as rich and overbearing as Juyan sect. Master, you think too highly of my wife. I'm still far from becoming a late-stage great cultivator. Qinshi said with a smile. Although he was being modest, he only said it was far. Revered Avidya turned his head and gave them a meaningful look. Fellow Taoist Qin, you're very confident. Just as he finished speaking and before Qinshi could answer, a soft sound suddenly rang out. Ju Wu grunted and was about to fall from the Lotus platform. Revered Avidya's movements were extremely fast. He waved his kasaya, rolled Ju Wu up, and placed him on the Lotus platform. Then he moved the 5 fingers of his left hand, performing a set of hand seals. A golden light sprinkled on Ju Wu's body. In just a few breaths, Ju Wu woke up with a groan. He stood up with a bit of shame, lowered his head and said, "Martial uncle, I'm useless. You don't have to be like this." Revered Avidya's tone was gentle, and his expression didn't change. With your cultivation level and the divine light protecting you, it'd still be very difficult for you to stay unscathed in this passage. But benefactor Mo Shi. He glanced back at Mo Qingge, whose expression was a bit grave. Little friend Mo is different from you, Revered Avidya said simply. Then he pinched a Buddha bead from his chest and chanted the name of Buddha. An incomparably powerful and holy aura burst from the Buddha bead, forcing even the drifting restrictions nearby to retreat a bit. Revered Avidya pinched the Buddha bead with his fingertips, forcibly crushing it and slapping it on Ju Wu's body. "Martial uncle. Ju Wu was taken aback when he saw the golden light protecting him. It's just a worldly possession. You don't need to feel sorry for it. This was all Revered Avidya said. Mo Chinga and Qin Shi glanced at each other. The two of them understood that this string of Buddha beads must be Revered Avidya's natal magic weapon. It was merely one of them, but it already had such an imposing aura. The strength of a great late nascent soul cultivator was indeed unfathomable. With the help of Revered Avidya's Buddha beads, the situation was temporarily stabilized. The four of them advanced in the passage in an orderly manner. However, the real danger came on the next part of the passage. If it was just a drifting restriction, even slightly stronger early-stage nascent soul cultivators could pass through it. Fu Yaozi wouldn't have needed to remind them like that. It was only now that the four of them realized the danger of this passage wasn't a lie. Rumble. The sound of wind and thunder resounded in the darkness. Then, without any warning, a hurricane suddenly attacked them. Qin Shi's expression changed slightly. The sword aura around them let out a soft cry and flashed with red light. It was almost taken away from its original position. As for Revered Avidya's Buddha light barrier, it even shook a little as if it would break in the next moment. Even though she had all kinds of secret techniques to protect herself, Mo Chinga felt suffocated. She felt the enormous pressure almost crushing her. Even if her strength surpassed cultivators in the same realm as her, she wasn't a nascent soul cultivator after all, so she couldn't resist this kind of pressure at all. On the contrary, because of Revered Avidya's Buddha beads, she was still standing firmly on the Lotus platform. But at this time even Qin Shi couldn't take care of her. With a solemn expression, he used all his strength to control the sword formation to resist the hurricane. Mo Chinga continuously patted several talismans on her body and put away the white silk handkerchief to protect herself tightly. Then she took out medicinal pills from her Qingquan bag and swallowed them regardless of how many there were. This way the pressure finally lessened a little. She heaved a sigh of relief and kept up with the journey so as not to cause more trouble. The hurricane grew bigger and bigger. Rumble. Thunder began to rumble frequently, carrying an incomparably shocking momentum, exploding around them. But such a shocking thunder couldn't tear apart the darkness. It was as if this was a bottomless pit with no exit. Heavenly thunder. Qin Shi whispered. Mo Chinga's expression changed slightly. Heavenly thunder. Could it be heavenly tribulation thunder? Thunder spells had always been the most destructive spell in the cultivation world. In terms of power, it wasn't necessarily stronger than fire spells, but it was easier to break through defenses and hit the weak points than fire spells. Therefore, heavenly tribulation was usually thunder tribulation, so one could imagine how terrifying thunder spells were. Amit Ba. Revered Avidya suddenly shouted. His Buddhist name was like thunder, and his voice coincided with the heavenly thunder, turning into sound waves that suppressed the sound of the heavenly thunder. Qin Shi's movements weren't slow either. His sword light instantly turned into sword aura, and deep blue flames sprang out of his arms. Extreme Yang Real Fire was injected into the 3 Yang Real Fire sword to fight against the hurricane and the lightning. Rumble. Chi. The sound was endless. Mo Chinga tried her best to protect herself and followed him closely. This kind of danger lasted for a long time. Finally, a white light appeared in front of them. In an instant, the thunder disappeared, the hurricane disappeared, and the rich spiritual aura rushed toward them. Chapter 463. Fellow Taoists, you came so quickly. Master Taoist Yuan Mu was slightly surprised to see the 4 of them. We were just lucky. Venerable Wuming said with a smile. His gaze swept over the people present and his white eyebrows twitched. He asked, Fellow Taoist Yuan Mu, what's going on? The first 3 groups to enter the Immortal Palace were 6 people from Zhiyin sect, 4 from Yushan Academy, and Devil Monarch Guifeng and his disciple. Now, the 2 middle-stage nascent soul cultivators from Zhiyin sect seemed to be seriously injured and were sitting cross-legged to regulate their breaths. Yushan Academy even lost an early-stage cultivator. Even Devil Monarch Guifeng's expression was very unsightly, especially when he saw the 4 of them coming out of the passage safely without any injuries. Yu Shuxing's expression turned gloomy. Master Taoist Yuan Mu also looked uneasy. He said, I can only blame myself for underestimating the dangers in the passage. I was too careless and caused my 2 junior martial brothers to be injured. Mo Chinga and Qin Shi glanced at each other and exchanged glances. The hurricane in the passage was indeed powerful. If they were careless, it was normal to get injured. Zhiyin sect sent 2 late-stage and 3 middle-stage cultivators, yet 2 of them were seriously injured on the way to the Immortal Palace. No wonder Master Taoist Yuan Mu looked so unsightly. As for Yushan Academy, the missing early-stage cultivator probably died in the passage, and the other early-stage cultivator seemed to be seriously injured. Yu Shuxing miscalculated this time. Yushan Academy couldn't compare to Jiyan sect. They only brought 2 early-stage nascent soul cultivators to help. Now, one was dead and the other was injured, so they were basically useless. Venerable Wuming lowered his head and chanted the name of Buddha. He sighed and said, "What a pity, what a pity. I didn't expect fellow Taoist Wuming and fellow Taoist Qin to actually work together. You two led 2 juniors and still passed the passage safely. What a blessing," Yu Shuxing said. He sounded like he was rejoicing, but he was also gnashing his teeth. Venerable Wuming naturally wouldn't get angry. He smiled and said, "Our Huayan Temple's cultivation technique is a bit weak. Fortunately, our body refining technique is pretty good." Yu Shuxing knew Venerable Wuming was right. He was in a bad mood to vent his anger, so he just snorted and no longer said anything. Master Taoist Yuan Mu swept his gaze over Qin Shi and Mo Tiange with a complicated expression on his face. Although the other party's strength was slightly weaker, he had Fu Yaozi's divine sense and had made preparations beforehand, so it wasn't strange for him to pass through safely. "Fellow Taoists," Perfected Yuan Mu quickly raised his spirits and said, "We are only one step ahead. There are still many fellow Taoists behind us. If we delay any longer, it will not be a good thing." Yu Shuxing quickly calmed down and nodded. "That's right. Since we have the holy relic in our hands, we should seize the initiative. In that case, in Mr. Yu's opinion, what should we do next?" Yu Shuxing's expression darkened when he heard this. He glanced at the heavily injured cultivators and said, "Why do you ask when you already know the answer?" Immortal Yuan Mu sighed and said, "I have no choice but to ask my injured junior brothers to wait here. Time is of the essence. I hope you can understand." 2 people from Jiyan sect were seriously injured, one from Yushan Academy was dead and one was injured, while the other 3 parties were unscathed. Of course, they would not object to enlightened Master Yuan Mu's suggestion. As for the 3 cultivators, although they were somewhat unwilling, they were also helpless. They were all sect cultivators and understood that the overall situation was more important. Now, they would only be a burden to their sect, so they could only give in. However, there must be a lot of fated chances in the Immortal Palace. If they looked for another path, they might have a chance. Thinking of this, a middle-stage cultivator from Jiyan sect reluctantly said, "Senior Martial Brother Yuan Mu is right. This matter is of great importance. We will wait here for your good news." The understanding of his fellow disciples made enlightened Master Yuan Mu's expression lighten up. He immediately said warmly, "Junior brothers, don't be disheartened. The matter of immortal opportunity cannot be determined. It is possible for it to fall on anyone's head. No matter what, we will meet here in 3 days and leave the Immortal Palace together." "Yes, Senior Martial Brother Yuan Mu." The cultivator from Yushan Academy also nodded at Yu Shuxing. The 3 cultivators who had been abandoned all had gloomy expressions on their faces. Although enlightened Master Yuan Mu's comfort was not unreasonable, they all knew that the possibility was too small. After making a decision, the group quickly regrouped. They had just entered the Immortal Palace, but 4 cultivators were missing. Now, there were only 4 people from Jiyan sect and 2 people from the other 4 sects, so there were only 12 people in total. Among them, 5 were late-stage nascent soul cultivators, 2 were middle-stage nascent soul cultivators, and 5 were core formation cultivators. Such a team would be very terrifying in the entire mortal realm. There were only 11 late-stage nascent soul great cultivators in Yunzhong. However, everyone's heart was heavy. They were forced to abandon their companions when they just entered the Immortal Palace. For them, the top great cultivators in the mortal realm who had been able to call the wind and summon the rain for 1,000 years, this was indeed a disgrace. They couldn't help but think of the 5 saints of that year. Their strength hadn't reached their peak yet, but they all retreated from the Immortal Palace unscathed. Sure enough, their talents were not just limited to cultivation. Little friend Mo enlightened Master Yuan Mu looked at Mo Tiange. "You should know this route, right?" Mo Tiange nodded and said, "This spiritual mountain was the mountain gate of a big ancient cultivation sect, and this Immortal Palace was its base. According to Senior Fu Yaozi's guidance, there are 3 places for immortal opportunities. The first is the pill concocting room, the second is the suture depository, and the third is the storehouse. There are certainly immortal pills from the distant past in the pill concocting room, but those immortal pills are too old and can't be taken anymore. If we go to the pill concocting room, we'll only see the pill concocting tools from the distant past. Of course, there are also some spiritual treasures like pill cauldrons, but the valuable ones have all been taken away by the 5 saints of that year. What about the sutra depository and the storehouse? Yu Shuxing asked. Mo Chinga raised the corner of her mouth and said, the 5 saints haven't really touched the sutra depository, but there are many restrictions inside, so it's also very dangerous. Seniors are all late-stage nascent soul great cultivators, so I'm afraid it'll be very difficult for you to find cultivation techniques that are helpful to you. Little friend Mo, you don't have to worry about this. Master Taoist Yuan Mu's expression was solemn as he said slowly, we old fellows have been stuck in the late-stage nascent soul realm for at least a few hundred years. If we can't make a breakthrough, no matter how high our cultivation levels are now, we'll just be a pile of bones when the time comes. We know very well whether this risk is worth it or not. Mo Chenga nodded. Just as she was about to continue speaking, she heard Demon Monarch Guifeng, who had been silent all this time, say, Little friend Mo, looking at the layout of this immortal palace, it should be a Tao cultivation sect, right? Wouldn't it be useless to devil cultivators like us? Tao cultivation sects naturally stored Tao secret manuals, while Confucianism and Buddhism had doctrines that were similar to those of Tao cultivation, so they could also be cultivated. However, devil cultivators were the opposite. They couldn't be used at all. Mo Chinga said, Senior Guifeng, since Demon Venerable Tianyao could obtain fated chances from here, you can naturally do the same. A real big sect wouldn't only store their own cultivation techniques. Of course, if Senior thinks there's no need to take this risk, I have nothing to say. Entering this immortal palace was voluntary. If Demon Monarch Guifeng gave up, there would be one less person to share the benefits with, and the others would be very happy. Sure enough, Demon Monarch Guifeng said, I'm just asking. Little friend Mo, why are you so anxious? Mo Chinga smiled and continued, as for the storehouse, it's naturally the most important thing in a sect. Senior Fuyazi said that the cultivator with the highest cultivation level in this sect definitely isn't just in the deification realm. Therefore, the restrictions in the storehouse also far surpass those in the deification realm. With Senior's cultivation levels, the most you can do is break the restrictions in the nascent soul realm and obtain the corresponding treasures. Although they were only treasures in the nascent soul realm, how could the treasures of the distant past compare to today's treasures? Once they heard this, everyone's eyes lit up. Little friend Mo, Master Taoist Yuan Mu asked, could it be that the 5 sages didn't take away all the nascent soul realm treasures? Mo Chinga said, when the 5 sages entered the immortal palace, they spent a lot of effort to reach the storehouse. They weren't strong enough, so they only took away a portion of the treasures. Fellow Taoists who inherited the holy objects should know this. Ling Yunhe was the first to nod. That's right. The holy objects the 4 of them owned didn't leave behind strong divine senses, so they only had a rough idea of where the immortal opportunity was. Unlike Mo Chinga, Fuyazi's divine sense hadn't dispersed yet, so he even knew the route clearly. If they didn't have Mo Chinga on this trip, they'd probably lose most of their strength when they found the sutra depository or the storehouse. At that time, it would be hard to say how many treasures they'd be able to take away. Since that's the case, there's no time to lose. Let's set off now, Master Taoist Yuan Mu said as he looked at the glittering passageway. They'd been delayed for a while, but more people were about to come in. They didn't know whether there were cultivators who died in the passageway. No one was willing to waste time. After the group finished organizing, they quickly set off. The immortal palace was majestic and magnificent with lofty buildings. The big parts were grand and the small parts were exquisite. Just from the architecture alone, one could tell that the cultivation group this immortal palace belonged to definitely wasn't a small one. Inside the immortal palace, there were plazas, memorial arches, gardens, long streets and halls. It could be said that this was practically a small city, so there were all kinds of buildings here. Mo Chinga judged that this immortal palace was almost as big as 10 of Xianqing School's main peaks combined. Presumably, the cultivators of this cultivation group all lived here in the past, unlike Xianqing School where they lived on separate peaks. After entering the immortal gate, they saw a huge plaza that could accommodate more than 10,000 people. The entire immortal palace was built with high-grade ice attribute spirit stones. The entire plaza was as white as snow and overflowing with spiritual aura like a glacier or a snowfield. A group of 12 people walked through the plaza. All of them felt the dense spiritual aura around them, which was almost visible to the naked eye. Ling Yunhe raised his head and looked around. He blurted out, could it be that this cultivation group specializes in cultivating ice attribute cultivation techniques? There are so many high-grade ice attribute spirit stones here. If cultivators with ice spiritual roots cultivate here, how could these nascent soul cultivators not have thought of this? Ling Xiu sighed. Unfortunately, none of us have ice spiritual roots. Demon Monarch Guifang raised the corner of his mouth and said coldly, that girl Yi Shuang should be happy. She's a cultivator with ice spiritual roots. He was talking about Demon Monarch Yi Shuang, the city lord of Yexiao City. Ha! Yu Shuxing chuckled and said, unfortunately the Immortal Palace's passage can only be opened for 3 days. Otherwise, it would have been great for fellow Taoist Yi Shuang to cultivate here. While the nascent soul cultivators were chatting, Mo Chenga suddenly thought of a problem. She used her divine sense to ask Fu Yaozi, Master, since this immortal palace is built with ice attribute spirit stones, why is the sacrificial temple below worshipping the vermilion bird? The azure dragon was wood, the white tiger was metal, the vermilion bird was fire, the black tortoise was water, and the qilin was earth. This was an ice attribute immortal palace, so why was it built on top of the fire attribute vermilion bird sacrificial temple? Chapter 464. It's very simple. Fu Yaozi answered, you know spiritual aura of the same attribute is helpful for cultivation, but do you know that spiritual aura of the opposite attribute can balance the spiritual aura circulation in the body and stimulate the absorption of spiritual aura? Mo Chenga was a little stunned, but then she remembered that her and Qin Shi's cultivation techniques were yin and yang, so they complemented each other. This immortal palace is a relic from the distant past era. There were also many relics from the distant past era, so they also advocated the way of balance, Fu Yaozi added. I see. She thought for a moment then asked, Master, in that case aren't the cultivation techniques left in this immortal palace very beneficial to me? Yes, the way of balance recorded inside is very beneficial to us. Fu Yaozi chuckled and said, of course the art of the origin mainly existed in the distant past era. Most of it was lost in the distant past era, and the mainstream cultivation method at that time has become the current one. This distant past era cultivation group probably recruited disciples with water spiritual roots so that they could practice ice attribute cultivation techniques. Mo Chenga remembered Zhengfa sect in the northernmost glacier. They recruited disciples with water spiritual roots, and their cultivation techniques were all water and ice attribute. There were many such cultivation groups in the cultivation world that had unique requirements for their disciples. For example, Danding School recruited disciples with fire spiritual roots because cultivators with fire spiritual roots would be more talented in pill concocting. Although Spirit Beast Sect, one of the 7 great cultivation groups in the Celestial Pole, didn't have any requirements for spiritual roots, they had to be talented in learning the language of beasts, which was more difficult than the requirements for spiritual roots. After safely passing through the square without any accidents, the group of 12 felt a little relieved. At this time, several white lights flashed in the passage at the entrance of the Immortal Palace, and the figures of other cultivators appeared. Although the passage was very dangerous, the cultivators who could reach the Immortal Palace weren't weak, especially those in the late nascent soul stage. Even if they were careless, it wouldn't be a problem for them to enter the Immortal Palace. After passing through the square and a large hall, layers of pavilions appeared in front of them. At first glance they couldn't see the end of it. Master Taoist Yuanmu narrowed his eyes and said in a deep voice, divine sense is actually forbidden here? The other nascent soul cultivators all looked solemn. They had also discovered this point. In this place they were unable to extend their divine senses. Once they extended their divine senses, they would be blocked by an invisible barrier. Ling Yun has said, it's not surprising that there are restrictions that restrict one's divine sense in the ancient great sections. After all, it's an important place in the sect. If everyone used their divine sense, it would be too casual. Perfected being Yuan Mu nodded when he heard that. That was indeed the case. Even the Jian sect had this kind of restriction, let alone the ancient sects. However, those above the core formation stage were not restricted. He said, however, even after such a long time, there are no signs of weakening, as expected of an ancient restriction. Scholar Yu furrowed his brows and said, furthermore, even the spiritual sense of a nascent soul cultivator is restricted. I really don't know how powerful the cultivators of this sect are. Everyone else had the same thoughts, and they felt even more anticipation towards the goal of this trip. Seeing as the cultivation bases of the high-grade cultivators in this sect were unfathomable, there was a much greater chance that they would be able to attain the opportunity to reach the deity transformation stage. Seniors, please come this way, Mo Chenga said. Perfected being Yuan Mu said politely, Little friend Mo, please lead the way. Mo Chinga smiled but didn't say anything. She took the lead and stepped onto the veranda. Upon seeing this, She shook his sleeves to protect her with a sword formation while he followed closely behind her. Logically speaking, she was only a core formation cultivator. With a late-stage nascent soul cultivator present, it wasn't her turn to be the vanguard. However, everyone else was wary of her. After all, in this small team they were all competitors. When the time came, they might even turn against each other and become enemies in order to seize the immortal fate. Who knew if she would play any tricks when she showed them the way, so they naturally had to be on guard. After walking for a while, they bypassed a small courtyard and arrived at a garden. Suddenly, the view in front of them became clear. Devil Aura. Master Taoist Yuanmu exclaimed as soon as they stepped into the garden. This garden wasn't big, it should only be the private garden of an ancient cultivator. In the flower bed of the garden, there were both ornamental spiritual flowers and medicinal spiritual herbs. After hundreds of thousands of years without the care of an owner, they had long fallen into disuse. Only a few remnants were left, growing crookedly. Although these spiritual herbs didn't grow well, the spiritual aura in this immortal palace was very rich. Moreover, they had been here for a long time, so they were worth picking. Unfortunately, there were several clouds of devil aura visible to the naked eye scattered in the garden, eroding these spiritual flowers and spiritual herbs until they lost their spirituality. This devil aura was very solid and had a strange aura, different from the devil aura scattered in any devil domain. Seeing this devil aura, everyone's gaze fell on Guifang Demon Monarch. Guifang Demon Monarch frowned. A puzzled expression appeared on his gentle and fair face. He said, "The devil aura in this space is very strange. It seems to be much more brilliant than the devil aura we cultivate." He only said this one sentence before he shut up. "Scholar," you asked, "anything else?" Guifang Demon Monarch glanced at him then shook his head. "Nothing else. I've never come into contact with this kind of devil aura, so I can't explain it. On the other hand, Mr. Yu has always been erudite and multi-talented. I wonder if you've heard of him?" Scholar, you didn't know. He just shook his head and said no more. Fellow Taoists," Venerable Avidya said with a smile, "this old monk realized that this devil aura seems familiar." Master Taoist Yuanmu raised his eyebrows and stared at him. "Fellow Taoist Avidya, the characteristic of your Buddhist cultivation techniques is to restrain devil aura. Have you seen it before?" "In fact, everyone has." Venerable Avidya suddenly opened his eyes and looked at Qin Shi. "Fellow Taoist Qin, am I right?" Under the gazes of the 6 nascent soul cultivators, Qin Shi nodded. "Yes." Mo Chenga remembered that when she was attacked by Mei Feng, Venerable Avidya saved her. Presumably, he had a deeper impression of primordial devil aura because of that. With this reminder, Master Taoist Yuanmu immediately remembered. The devil cultivator fellow Taoist Qin killed. The expressions of the nascent soul cultivators changed. The more they thought about it, the more certain they were, and the more vigilant they looked at Qin Shi. This devil aura was so brilliant, but that middle-stage nascent soul devil cultivator was still easily killed by him. Scholar, you thought for a while and said, "No, that's not right. Although that devil cultivator's devil aura is similar to the devil aura here, it's still different. It doesn't seem to be as solid and much weaker." Fellow Taoist Guifang, am I right? Guifang Devil Monarch nodded. "Yes, that devil cultivator's devil aura is similar to the devil aura here, but it's not as good. It might also be because his cultivation level wasn't high enough." Master Taoist Yuanmu shook his head. Unfortunately, that devil cultivator was already killed by fellow Taoist Qin, otherwise. Although he said that, he glanced at Qin Shi. Although the devil cultivator was dead, his things fell into Qin Shi's hands, but they didn't know whether there were any cultivation techniques or the like among them. Qin Shi naturally wouldn't hand over the things he already had. He just smiled and pretended he didn't see anything. Master Taoist Yuanmu was the head of a sect and a top late-stage nascent soul cultivator, so he was embarrassed to say it out loud. Seeing that Qin Shi didn't understand, he could only give up. In any case, devil techniques and the like were of no use to Juyan's sect. As they talked, the group of 12 people continued to move forward. Mo Chenga was halfway there when she suddenly felt a gust of devil aura soaring into the sky, surrounding her 3 young real fire sword formation. With a bang, real fire sprang out. She only had time to take a step back, but all the nascent soul cultivators were already on guard. Refined corpses. Upon seeing the source of the devil aura, Master Taoist Yuanmu's expression changed. Inside the small parlor in the garden, several charred corpses wrapped in devil aura staggered towards them. The devil aura around these refined corpses was so thick that they couldn't see their cultivation levels for a moment. Junior, step back. Scholar, you shouted. He waved the folding fan in his hand and was ready for battle. Mo Chenga stepped back without hesitation, standing at the very back with Ling Yunhe and the other 3 people. How could there be refined corpses? Master Taoist Yuan Mu's gaze fell on her. Refined corpses were things of the devil path. Some devil cultivators destroyed cultivators' primordial spirits, then controlled them with special techniques to make them into puppets. This was refined corpses. Compared to spiritual beasts, refined corpses were much stronger. Because refined corpses were originally cultivators, they could use magic weapons and cultivate. The higher the cultivation level of the cultivator who made the refined corpse, the more powerful the refined corpse would be. If it was a perfect refined corpse with a master who was proficient in the Tao of control, its fighting strength could rival that of a cultivator in the same realm. For example, Demon Monarch Yu Ying's divine power wasn't too outstanding, but because he had 2 refined corpses in the early stage of the nascent soul realm, no late-stage nascent soul cultivator in Yunzhong dared to underestimate his strength. Mo Chenga frowned and answered, Senior Fu Yaozi said that there's devil aura in this space. If those cultivators died here, their corpses would be infected by the devil aura and turn into refined corpses. However, the appearance of this kind of natural refined corpse requires luck and coincidence, so the possibility is very low. Back then they did find refined corpses in the Immortal Palace, but they weren't here. Maybe those refined corpses wandered here. Natural refined corpses. Demon Monarch Guifang's expression changed slightly. This is indeed possible. Natural refined corpses are more difficult to deal with than man-made refined corpses. Cultivators would always lose some of their cultivation level when making refined corpses, but natural refined corpses wouldn't. Because their primordial spirits weren't artificially erased, they would even retain their previous fighting habits. As they spoke, the refined corpse was already in front of them, pouncing on Qin Shi, who was the closest to them. Qin Shi didn't dodge. This garden wasn't big, so there was nowhere to hide even if he wanted to. He raised his hand and a light shield suddenly appeared in front of him. At the same time, all the sword aura of the 3 young real fire sword hovering in the air merged into one. With a whoosh, the sword was covered with extreme young real fire and slashed at the refined corpse. Clang. Qin Shi frowned, waved his sword, and used extreme young real fire to force the refined corpse back 2 steps. Then he himself retreated. These refined corpses are at least in the nascent soul realm, and their bodies are very hard. Even my sword can't cut them. Although he wasn't a sword cultivator, the sharpness of the 3 young real fire sword wasn't inferior to that of a sword cultivator's sword. However, when he slashed at the refined corpse just now, it unexpectedly wasn't damaged in the slightest. It only retreated because it was afraid of extreme young real fire. Upon hearing this, the other nascent soul cultivators' expressions changed. Master Taoist Yuan Mu's gaze swept across the area. He then looked at the unending stream of refined corpses appearing in the small garden. With a grave expression he said, Fellow Taoists, our path of retreat has been cut off. If we don't kill these refined corpses, I'm afraid we won't be able to leave. Chapter 465. All the nascent soul cultivators used all kinds of methods. Mo Chenga and the other 4 cultivators were only in the core formation realm, so they basically couldn't get involved. They could only hide at the back to avoid dragging others down. If Qin Shi wasn't here, Mo Chenga would find this scene very satisfying. A group of great cultivators was fighting in front of her, and she still had to take care of her own life. But now that Qin Shi was also among them, she felt it was dull and tasteless. Unfortunately, his strength was too low. If he wanted to help, it was best if he didn't get in the way. Of course, she wasn't idle either. It was rare to see several late-stage nascent great cultivators fighting together. Their divine abilities were astonishing, and if he could comprehend a little of it, it would be very helpful for him to form his nascent soul. She was not the only one with such thoughts. Ling Yunhe and the other 3 were also watching intently. Although most of these refined corpses were at the nascent soul stage, the 7 nascent soul cultivators were not weak, so there was no immediate danger. Nevertheless, Mo Chenga was rather worried when she saw the spiritual aura fluctuations caused by their attacks. Although divine sense was forbidden in this place, if the spiritual chi fluctuation was too obvious, it might attract the attention of others. If other nascent soul stage cultivators came over, it would be difficult to deal with them. After all, None of them wanted to share this immortal opportunity with anyone else. What she could think of, these nascent soul cultivators naturally couldn't think of. Scholar Yu repelled a refined corpse and said in a deep voice, "Fellow Taoists, we can't afford to waste any more time here. Let's fight while we retreat." Reverend Yuanmu nodded. That's right. It would take too much time to kill them all. He turned to look at Mo Chenga and the others and said, "Fellow Taoist Avidya, I'll have to trouble you with these juniors." Reverend Avidya smiled and nodded. Reverend Yuanmu then looked at Reverend Iron Mask Ling Xiu and Scholar Yu, Senior Brother Iron Mask, Junior Brother Ling, "Mr. Yu, I'll have to trouble the three of you to bring up the rear." After the three of them agreed, he looked at the others and said, "Fellow Taoist Guifeng, Fellow Taoist Qin, the three of you will take the vanguard." Guifeng Devil Monarch had no objections, and Qin Shi also nodded in agreement. Mo Chinga secretly admired his methodical way of handling things. This Reverend Yuanmu was worthy of being the first seat Grand Supreme Elder of the number 1 sect in Yunzhong. He took the lead and put his senior and junior brothers in the back. The one protecting the 5 of them in the middle was the most trustworthy Reverend Wu Ming. Moreover, among the 7 of them, Master Taoist Yuanmu, Guifeng Devil Monarch, and Qin Shi were known for their offensive prowess. Revered Wu Ming's Buddhist golden light was known for its steadiness and gentleness. As for Master Taoist Iron Mask, Ling Xiu and Scholar Yu, their divine abilities were slightly lacking, but their defenses were pretty good. This arrangement was just right. Master Taoist Yuanmu let out a soft shout and the exquisite pagoda in his hand moved, covering the corpse. The Guifeng Devil Monarch's hands were empty, but they were filled with devil aura. With Mo Chinga's eyesight, she could only see that this mass of devil aura was actually a set of ghost claws. This set of ghost claws had shape but no body. She didn't know whether it was made of special materials or because it was Guifeng Devil Monarch's unique secret technique. The 7 nascent soul cultivators fought and retreated. After an hour they finally left the courtyard. This battle didn't last too long, but it consumed a lot of their strength. As soon as these corpses smelled the breath of a living person, they would attack. Moreover, they weren't afraid of death, so they swarmed them and besieged them. It was really unbearable. Master Taoist Yuanmu glanced at them and said, "Fellow Taoists, let's take a break. Be careful in the immortal palace. It's better to have sufficient spiritual aura." Everyone nodded in agreement and looked for a place to rest. Qin Shi heaved a sigh of relief. He put the 3 young real fire sword back and found a remote corner to rest with Mo Chinga. "Here you go." Just as he swallowed a few medicinal pills, Qin Shi saw Mo Chinga quietly handing him something. "This is." Looking at the unremarkable bead in his hand, he was puzzled. "Spirit guiding bead." Mo Chinga glanced around. Qin Shi understood and flicked his fingers, casting a soundproof barrier. "This is a treasure I found in the place where the Mo family's ancestor passed away. This bead can be used to store spiritual aura and can be drawn from it when needed." Upon hearing this, Qin Shi played with it for a while, then probed it with his divine sense. He was surprised. This bead can actually store so much spiritual aura. Magic weapons that could store spiritual aura had always been rare. In the cultivation world, there were only 2 common ways to restore spiritual aura during fights of magical power: medicinal pills and spirit stones. However, the spiritual aura that could be restored by medicinal pills and spirit stones was pitifully little for high-level cultivators' dantians. Therefore, some cultivators came up with this kind of magic weapon to store spiritual aura and draw spiritual aura from it during fights of magical power. However, the materials needed to make this kind of magic weapon were very precious, and it couldn't store too much spiritual aura. Qin Shi tested this bead and found that it could actually restore more than half of his spiritual aura. He was already a nascent soul cultivator, and his dantian could store a lot of spiritual aura. If he used up all his spiritual aura, he would need at least several days to fully recover just by meditating. If this kind of magic weapon was placed in a trade fair, it would probably be fought over, wouldn't it? Especially for nascent soul cultivators, it was very difficult for them to restore their spiritual aura. If they had this thing, they would have a much higher chance of winning in fights of magical power. However, this kind of thing couldn't be bought even if you had money. Mo Chinga smiled and calmly swept her gaze over the others. "You have to be careful of these people. With this thing you'll have one more life." Qin Shi nodded and put away the spirit-attracting bead. Their opponents were all nascent soul cultivators, and they still had to rely on him for this journey. The spirit-attracting bead was more useful to him, but it wouldn't be of much use to Mo Chinga. Before long, Master Taoist Yuanmu stood up and asked, "Fellow Taoists, have you all rested enough?" With the help of endless high-level restorative panaceas, Qin Shi had long recovered his spiritual aura. He removed the soundproof barrier and stood up to meet up with Mo Chenga. Needless to say, the other nascent soul cultivators were all great cultivators from big cultivation groups, so how could they be poor? For this trip, they all prepared piles of spiritual pills and spirit stones, so they had long recovered their spiritual aura. Little friend Mo. Without needing Master Taoist Yuanmu to say anything, Mo Chenga automatically walked in front with Qin Shi. After leaving the garden, they saw a rope bridge that was hundreds of feet long connecting two peaks. This immortal palace occupied a very wide area, including all the peaks of Mount Lingshan. From the outside it looked like a palace, but they didn't know there was a universe inside. This rope bridge was also paved with high-level spirit stones. It was unknown what kind of spell was cast on it, but when more than 10 people stepped on it, it didn't move at all. Halfway there, Mo Chenga looked down and saw that the space between the two peaks was bottomless. There was only fog that blocked her line of sight. She frowned. She felt that this fog was mixed with some primordial devil aura and was very chaotic. Although it wasn't a big problem, her cultivation level was a bit low, so she felt uncomfortable. She pondered for a moment, then shook her sleeve and threw out the Tai Chi 8 diagrams. In midair, the Tai Chi 8 diagrams slowly unfolded. Water-like waves rippled around it, and wherever the waves passed, the aura gradually stabilized. Seeing this, Master Taoist Yuanmu praised, "Little friend Mo, this magic weapon is really rare. Its control of spiritual aura has reached an extremely exquisite level. Presumably, the person who made this magic weapon must be an expert." After calming the surrounding spiritual aura, Mo Chenga put the Tai Chi 8 diagrams back into her sleeve. As she walked, she answered, "This treasure was bestowed by my ancestor." "Senior, you flatter me." "Really? It seems that little friend Mo's sect is extraordinary." He cast a meaningful glance at Qin Shi. Unfortunately, Qin Shi only smiled and didn't answer. Yunzhong cultivators were good at controlling spiritual aura, which was something celestial pole cultivators couldn't do. No cultivator in the celestial pole could make this Tai Chi 8 diagrams, but Mo Yaoqing was born in Yunzhong and had a profound control of spiritual aura, so she could make this kind of magic weapon. However, neither of them would explain. It was best if they misunderstood. That way they would be afraid of them and wouldn't act rashly. After smoothly crossing the rope bridge, the group of people stopped. "Seniors, this is the road leading to the scripture depository," Mo Chenga said. Looking at the narrow mountain road in front of them, Ling Xiu asked, "Little friend Mo, why did you stop?" Mo Chenga didn't answer, but Scholar Yu sighed. "It's another restriction." Ling Xiu was startled. He looked carefully and vaguely found a slight fluctuation of spiritual aura in front of them. With his cultivation level in the middle stage of the nascent soul realm, he actually didn't notice this restriction. It was really too brilliant. Guifang Devil Monarch looked at it, then asked Mo Chenga, "Didn't the 5 saints come here before? Why is this restriction still intact?" Mo Chenga shook her head gently. "Senior Guifang, have you heard that brilliant restrictions can repair themselves?" Guifang Devil Monarch was stunned and frowned. Master Taoist Yuanmu and the others were also shocked. "So this is a restriction that can repair itself?" Mo Chenga nodded and said, "Seniors, it was the 5 seniors who worked together to break this restriction that year. Although Junior has Senior Fuyaozi's help now, I can't rely on my own strength to break this restriction." What she said was reasonable, so no one doubted her. The brilliance of this restriction was something nascent soul cultivators like them had never seen in their lives. If a core formation junior could smoothly break it with the guidance of Fuyao's divine sense, it would be too easy. After all, in the face of absolute strength, no matter how brilliant a technique was, it was useless. Scholar Yu took the lead and said, "That being the case, little friend Mo, please wait on the side." As he said that, he looked at Master Taoist Yuanmu and asked, "Fellow Taoist Yuanmu, what do you think?" Master Taoist Yuanmu frowned. After thinking for a while, he turned to Lingyun and said, "Soul restricting bead." Lingyun understood. He took a few steps forward and offered the soul restricting bead. Mo Chenga remembered that when she and Lingyun entered Carefree Valley, he once said that the soul restricting bead had a restraining effect on spiritual aura and divine senses, so it could pass through restrictions unimpeded. The one he had back then was only an imitation of the soul restricting bead. Presumably, the real thing should be even more powerful, right? Master Taoist Yuanmu stood in front of the restriction, holding the bead in one hand and making a hand seal with the other. A set of complicated hand seals was performed, and a white light flashed between his fingers. When he finished making the hand seals, he shouted softly and the white light hit the soul-restricting bead. With a soft buzz, the soul-restricting bead lit up and shone on the restriction on the mountain path. Under the soul-restricting bead's light, the powerful but imperceptible restriction had nowhere to hide. Everyone was delighted to see this, but in the next moment the soul-restricting bead's light flashed and eventually dimmed. This bead is indeed a rare treasure. Presumably it's old man Guaxian's work, right? Inside Emo Chenga's mind, Fuyao's faint voice rang out. Unfortunately, if this restriction was so easy to break, how could he take on the responsibility of guarding the scripture depository in this great ancient cultivation group? Chapter 466. After losing its effect, Master Taoist Yuanmu looked gloomy for a long time. Different from Wu Ming, God-forbidding bead was a real spiritual treasure inherited from Saint Guaxian and enshrined in Juyin sect for tens of thousands of years. Although there were countless outstanding cultivators in Juyin sect in the past 100,000 years, none of their inherited spiritual treasures were more powerful than God-forbidding bead. In the end, Master Taoist Yuanmu sighed helplessly, handed the bead back to Ling Yunhe and said, "Fellow Taoists, this restriction is extraordinary. I can't think of a solution right now." Guifeng Demon Monarch glanced at him and said faintly, "I know very little about formations, so I'm afraid I can't help in finding a way to break it. However, if there's anything I need help with, I'll do my best." Revered Wu Ming smiled and looked at Scholar Yu. "If that's the case, I can only trouble Mr. Yu." Scholar Yu nodded with a solemn expression. "I'll try my best." None of them was a professional array master. However, nascent soul stage cultivators, especially those who had spent hundreds or even thousands of years in the late stage of the nascent soul stage, were mostly proficient in miscellaneous skills. They were even more skilled than common array masters. Therefore, they didn't need to bring another array master with them. This was especially the case for Scholar Yu. He was an erudite great scholar with profound knowledge. His understanding of the Tao of formations was even deeper, so this matter was naturally left to him. Emo Chenga felt she didn't need to show off in front of these late-stage nascent soul cultivators, so she didn't say anything and just watched. Scholar Yu took out his compass, formation flags and other things and began to check around to determine yin, yang, and the 5 elements. Any formation, even the primordial grand formation, would be based on this, and there would be no exceptions. Therefore, the first thing a formation master would do when faced with an unfamiliar great formation was to determine yin, yang, and the 5 elements. This process would take a long time, so Emo Chenga simply took out her compass and formation-breaking items to observe yin, yang, and the 5 elements. Seeing this, Ju Wu asked curiously, "Benefactor Emo, do you also know formations?" Emo Chenga looked up and answered humbly, "I know a thing or two, so I don't dare to make a fool of myself." Upon hearing their conversation, Master Taoist Iron Mask, who had been silent the whole time, inadvertently glanced at them. He looked at them seriously for a while before he said, "Little friend Emo, you're too modest. Looking at the treasures in your hands, your attainments and formations must be quite high, right?" Emo Chenga cast a surprised look at Master Taoist Iron Mask, but she only smiled and said, "No matter how high juniors' attainments and formations are, it's still nothing in front of seniors. I just want to take this opportunity to learn from Senior Yu." Enlightened Master Iron Mask nodded slightly. He did not say anything else and looked away. With Emo Chenga's age, no matter how talented she was in formations, it would still be very difficult for her to be on par with nascent soul cultivators like them. However, he was quite surprised. He didn't expect that this junior was so young and was only a step away from the nascent soul realm. Yet, he was also proficient in formations. He was really a promising talent. Unfortunately, she was obviously from a large sect or clan, so it was impossible for her to be recruited by the Jian sect. Emo Chenga was holding her special compass, recording the yin, yang and 5 elements she observed one by one into a jade slip. Qin Shi, on the other hand, watched with interest from the side. He himself was quite proficient in miscellaneous studies. He was talented in pill concocting and tool refining, and he started studying talisman crafting when he was in the core formation realm. Now, he also had a certain level of proficiency in talisman crafting. However, he only knew a little about formations because he didn't have much interest in it and he didn't have much time to study it. Coincidentally, the things he wasn't good at were exactly the things Emo Chenga was good at. He really didn't know whether he should say they were a match made in heaven or not. Seeing that Emo Chenga's brows were knitting tighter and tighter, he couldn't help but ask, "What's wrong? Is it really that difficult?" Emo Chenga was mumbling something when she heard his question. She paused for a moment then raised her eyebrows. Look at Senior Yu, he's already like that, let alone me? She looked up. Sure enough, Scholar Yu was also frowning and mumbling something silently. Both of their expressions were exactly the same. He couldn't help but shake his head and smile. He then adjusted his breath and waited on the side. After a while, Mo Chenga asked him again, right, where's your mountain-fixing lantern? The mountain-fixing lantern was one of Qin Shi's magic weapons. He obtained it from a secret place a long time ago and it had a wonderful restrictive effect. However, since even the soul restraining bead didn't work, presumably the mountain-fixing lantern also wouldn't have any effect, right? Although that was what he thought, Qin Shi still took out the magic weapon. What? Is it useful? Mo Chenga didn't answer. She took the mountain-fixing lantern and looked at it for a while then said, it seems, this mountain-fixing lantern and this restriction used the same formation. The two of them didn't use a soundproof barrier, nor did they deliberately avoid other people. Upon hearing this voice, Scholar Yu suddenly turned around and stared at them. Mo Chenga didn't have time to pay attention to him. She once again probed with her divine comprehension, closed her eyes, and carefully explored the mysteries inside. After a while, she heaved a sigh of relief then raised her head to look at Scholar Yu. She waved the mountain-fixing lantern in her hand and said, Senior Yu, this thing might be helpful in breaking restrictions. Scholar Yu had long been waiting for her to say this, so he didn't stand on ceremony. He took the lantern and hurriedly nodded at the two of them to express his gratitude. His lifespan had already reached 1,000 years, and Scholar Yu had been immersed in the Tao of formations for at least several hundred years, so his attainments in formations weren't inferior to Mo Chenga's. Now that he had the mountain-fixing lantern, he hurriedly probed it with his divine sense. In just a while, his tightly furrowed brows relaxed. The others were all paying attention to him. Upon seeing this scene, Master Taoist Yuanmu asked with concern, Mr. Yu, can this thing really help in breaking restrictions? Scholar Yu didn't answer. He seemed to be immersed in it. Sometimes he looked like he was suddenly enlightened and sometimes he looked confused. But this didn't last too long. After a while he once again started to record something on the jade slip, but this time his speed was much faster. One moment he was observing the feng shui compass, the next moment he was examining the mountain-fixing lantern, and the next moment he was recording something. Several hours later, Scholar Yu finally put away the feng shui compass. His brows relaxed and he said, it's finally done. The others were all delighted and looked at him. Scholar Yu was in high spirits as he returned the mountain-fixing lantern to Qin Shi. At the same time he also smiled at Mo Chenga. I have to thank little friend Mo. If you hadn't discovered this, I'm afraid we would have had to waste a lot of time to find the way. Mo Chenga smiled. Senior Yu is too polite. Since they found the principle of restrictions, breaking restrictions wasn't difficult anymore. With several nascent soul seniors here, Mo Chenga didn't need to worry at all. She only needed to watch from the side. It was really a lucky hit. Fu Yaozi snorted. Upon hearing his unhappy tone, Mo Chenga found it funny. Master, in fact, you deliberately didn't give them a hint and let them play around here, right? Fu Yaozi said confidently, so what? I don't like this group of people. Mo Chenga couldn't help but laugh. She then said, I originally thought Master was too rational, but now I realize Master is also a human. Fu Yaozi didn't say anything for a long time. It was unclear whether he was angry or didn't know what to say. Mo Chenga didn't take it seriously and asked, Master, isn't the passage to the Immortal Palace only open for 3 days? Why do you still want to waste their time? If we stay here for too long, won't it be disadvantageous for us? There's nothing to worry about, Fu Yaozi said. Even if this restriction has the ability to repair itself, it's been going on for more than 100,000 years, so its power has decreased a lot. It's no longer at its peak. Besides, no matter what, they're great cultivators at the top of the world. Even if they're a bit worse than the 5 of us, they won't be much worse. If we could do it in the past, they should be able to do it too. He paused for a moment then said, it's good that we don't have much time. When the time comes, we'll go our separate ways. They're anxious to search for treasures according to the information Grandmaster left behind, so they won't have time to care about what we're doing. Oh, I see. Mo Chenga understood now. The others naturally had their own secrets. If they could safely go their separate ways to search for treasures, they wouldn't have time to cause trouble for them. In terms of searching for treasures, she had Fu Yaozi, so she had an advantage. If nothing unexpected happened, she would be one step faster than them. As they spoke, they'd already broken the restriction. This time, no one asked Mo Chenga to walk in front, so she just followed behind them with Qin Shi. The mountain road was narrow on both sides, only allowing 2 people to pass side by side. Yu Shuxing carefully observed, then said, "There aren't any other restrictions." Only then did the others set foot on the mountain road. They moved forward slowly and cautiously. When they reached the end, they saw a formation. This formation was different from the previous one. It was merely a transporting formation. With Yu Shuxing's attainments in formations, he quickly figured out the missing parts and put spirit stones in the corresponding positions to repair it. When the transporting formation lit up, they looked at each other, but no one said anything. Who would go in first in the end? This problem was really hard to solve. First, they didn't know if there would be any danger if they just went in like this. Second, this was the scripture pavilion, a place that specialized in collecting cultivation techniques. Who knew if the people who went in would get something first? Ba. The first to speak was revered Wu Ming. He smiled and said, "Since fellow Taoists can't decide for a while, let this old monk go in first." Master Taoist Yuanmu only hesitated for a moment before retreating. "I have no objections." After pondering for a moment, Yu Shuxing also nodded. Since the 2 of them retreated, Guifang Devil Monarch could only step aside. "Fellow Taoist Wu Ming, please." He looked reluctant. The Devil Path and Buddhism had old grievances in the Sea of Returning Ruins, not to mention the 2 of them even fought. Qin Shi and Mo Qiange didn't step forward, tacitly giving up. Revered Wu Ming put his palms together and stepped into the transporting formation with awareness. He put down the spirit stones to activate the transporting formation and disappeared in front of everyone. After revered Wu Ming entered, Master Taoist Yuanmu no longer had any scruples and snatched the 2nd place. His Jiyan sect was the strongest, so the others couldn't compete with him and could only give way. Then it was Yu Shuxing who led Han Shizhi. Guifang Devil Monarch seemed unwilling to clash with the others and was willing to give way. In the end, there were only 4 people left outside. Guifang Devil Monarch asked, "Fellow Taoist Qin, you don't mind if we, master and disciple, go first, right?" Qin Shi smiled and shook his head. In terms of cultivation level, he ranked last among these nascent soul cultivators, so he should be a bit more humble. When everyone else's figures disappeared, Fu Yaozi's voice rang out again. "You don't have identity tablets. After you go in, there'll be a small killing formation. Don't use magic weapons, use talismans." Chapter 467. The transporting formation lit up, and the scenery in front of her changed. Before Mo Qiange had time to look around, she already felt a strong killing intent. The spiritual aura shield on her body blocked something. When the strong spiritual aura wave hit her, she immediately put the talisman in her hand on her body. A golden light shone, and the spiritual aura around her slowly stabilized. Then, the sabers and arrows transformed from spiritual aura disappeared, and a fierce hurricane blew around them, carrying a large amount of hailstones. Qin Shi raised his hand, and a fiery red light gathered in his hand. The hailstones melted and disappeared as soon as they touched the red light. This situation lasted for half an hour before it stopped. The 2 of them stepped out of the transporting formation. When they looked up, they still saw a snow-white palace made of ice attribute high-grade spirit stones in front of them. Jade eaves stood majestically, and a plaque hung high above the palace door with the ancient words, "Sutra Depository" written on it. The strange thing was that the space where the Sutra Depository was located seemed to be completely independent. Mo Qiange looked around and found that the palace was filled with spiritual aura that blocked her divine sense. She couldn't see the surrounding scenery with her naked eyes. It seemed to be very far away but also seemed to be nothing. While she was looking around, Mo Qiange heard a cold snort. She turned around and saw Guifang Demon Monarch staring at them with a rather unfriendly expression. She finally realized the situation was a bit strange. Before them, the other 4 groups of people had already come in, and they all looked a bit embarrassed. The exquisite pagoda in Master Taoist Yuanmu's hand was scorched black. Master Taoist Iron Mask's hair was burned a bit, and Ling Shiyu's beard couldn't even be saved. The 4 people's clothes were full of scorch marks. Their clothes were probably intact because of the special materials. Yu Shuxing and Han Shizhi weren't much better. They were both scholars who usually paid attention to their appearance and elegance, but now they became elegants. Their bodies were full of stains and their clothes were disheveled. Guifang Demon Monarch and Yang Qingji were slightly better, but they were also experts with no elegance at all. Only Venerable Ming didn't seem to be affected much. He shook the weeds on his clothes and quickly restored his appearance. Mo Qiange smiled secretly. She knew what was going on without asking. Fu Yaozi said that the scripture depository was the place where the sect kept their cultivation methods, and only disciples of the sect could enter. Therefore, all cultivators who entered through the teleportation array should have an identity token on them. If they had an identity card, the killing array would not be triggered, but they did not. Therefore, as soon as they stepped into the cabinet, the killing array would immediately be activated. However, before the immortal palace was abandoned, there were disciples guarding the hidden scripture pavilion. Therefore, they didn't kill them all and left them with a chance of survival. According to the rules of many sects, disciples were not allowed to use magic treasures when entering an important place like the sutra depository. They would even use certain methods to temporarily disable the magic treasures. Therefore, if the killing array was activated, the person who came would use a magic treasure, and it would lead to a merciless killing. As long as the person did not use a magic treasure, the power would be greatly reduced, and the guarding disciple could close the killing array in time to prevent some disciples from being careless and losing their lives in vain. That was Fu Yaozi's conjecture, but it was reasonable. That was about it. However, the others had never experienced it before, so they naturally did not know this. Although their lives were not in danger, they more or less suffered some injuries. Master Taoist Yuanmu's expression was cold. He said in a heavy voice, "Little friend Emo, you didn't do this on purpose, did you?" Emo Chinga naturally knew what he was referring to, but she asked in surprise, "Senior, what do you mean?" Guifeng Demon Monarch snorted then said, "Otherwise, how could the two of you be so relaxed? Why didn't you warn us in advance?" Emo Chinga was even more surprised. "This formation isn't that powerful. Do I need to say anything?" The several nascent soul cultivators were stunned. For a moment they couldn't answer. To be honest, this killing array was indeed not that powerful. If they were prepared, they could easily pass through it. But if it wasn't powerful, how could they be in such a difficult situation? This formation became stronger when it met a strong opponent and weaker when it met a weak opponent. As soon as they saw danger, they casually used their magic treasures, which led to the formation's inescapable net-like attacks. With the methods of peak great cultivators like them, although they wouldn't die here, it wouldn't be easy for them to escape. Revered Wu Ming was a little better because his Buddhist cultivation technique didn't attach as much importance to magic treasures as the others. But for them to admit that this matter had nothing to do with Mo Chenga, what a joke. How could they wash their faces? Fellow Taoists. In the end, it was still revered Wu Ming who came out to smooth things over. "We've already entered the treasure mountain. Do we still want to waste time here?" Upon hearing this, Master Taoist Yuanmu and the others' expressions finally eased. With treasures in front of them, fated chances were more important. Guifeng Demon Monarch looked at the sutra depository and asked, "Little friend Mo, are there any other mysteries here?" Mo Chenga shook her head then answered, "Senior Fu Yaozi said we shouldn't think about the place where those top-grade cultivation techniques are stored. This distant past-era group might have great ascension cultivators, so those places aren't places we can enter. As for the place where cultivation techniques below the deification realm are stored, the restrictions outside have been removed, so there's no danger there. We can act according to our own abilities." Master Taoist Yunmu stroked his beard then asked, "So now we can search for cultivation techniques based on our own abilities?" "Correct." Master Taoist Yuanmu and Master Taoist Iron Mask exchanged glances then looked at Scholar Yu and the others. "That being the case, let's go in." Everyone naturally had no objections and entered the sutra depository together. No one had taken care of it for at least more than 100,000 years, so this palace was actually a bit dilapidated. The tables and chairs were placed crookedly, and only a few of them were still intact. There was dust everywhere and there was practically no place to stand. However, because of the rich spiritual aura here, it appeared to be full of immortal aura and didn't look dilapidated at all. Everyone raised their heads to look around. The hall of the sutra depository was extremely spacious, more than enough to accommodate several hundred people. There were tables and chairs in the front, which should be where the disciples in charge of the sutra depository sat. In the center of the hall, there were decorative sculptures and furnishings. After a cursory glance, they realized they weren't magic weapons, so they skipped over them. In addition, there were several transporting formations lined up side by side at the bottom. These transporting formations were still in good condition. They didn't know whether they'd always been well preserved or whether they were restored by Senior Five Saints. But they were dim, so their spirit stones must have been used up. According to the records on the Jade slips in the administration office, these transporting formations all led to places where cultivation techniques were stored. However, the categories were slightly different. They were respectively 5-element spells, cultivation techniques, martial cultivation path, miscellaneous studies of pill making and tools, and notes on experiences. As for which one was which, it wasn't clearly written. Everyone looked at each other. Master Taoist Yuanmu was the first to speak. Little friend Emo, there's nothing to pay attention to here, right? Emo Chenga shook her head. There are protective restrictions inside. It doesn't matter even if we enter the wrong one. Master Taoist Yuanmu nodded. The Sutra Depository was an important place of the cultivation group. When the cultivation group existed, there were naturally disciples guarding it. As long as they touched the restrictions, they would be discovered. But now that this immortal palace was already abandoned, no matter how they touched it, no one would come to drive them out. It was fine as long as there was no danger. Then we're free to do as we please? Ling Xiu asked. Wait. Scholar Yu spoke up to stop them. Fellow Taoists, we've been working together all this way. Now that the fated chance is right in front of us, shouldn't we come up with some rules? Guifeng Devil Monarch asked in a heavy voice. Fellow Taoist Yu, what do you mean? Nothing, Scholar Yu said faintly. But I'll say the ugly words first. Although we're collaborators now, none of us can completely trust each other. It's better to make everything clear. Master Taoist Yuanmu pondered for a moment then nodded. You're right. What Mr. Yu said makes sense. Scholar Yu looked at Guifeng Devil Monarch. Seeing that he didn't say anything else, Scholar Yu continued, there are 5 transporting formations here. We'll split into 5 groups. Each group will enter one and we won't interfere with each other. What do you think? Guifeng Devil Monarch narrowed his eyes and said coldly, Fellow Taoist Yu, on the surface each group will enter one. This is very fair, but the contents of the cultivation techniques inside are very different. How can a collection of miscellaneous studies compare to the 5 elements immortal techniques? Of course not, Scholar Yu said calmly. But we have a fair chance. Whatever we choose is a fated chance. If we choose the useless one, we can only blame ourselves for being unlucky. But, fellow Taoist Guifeng, Scholar Yu asked solemnly, if we enter together with the cultivation techniques in front of us, can we really guarantee peaceful coexistence? Guifeng Devil Monarch was taken aback as he shut his mouth. Scholar Yu was right. The treasures were right in front of them. If they were to gather together at this moment with the difference in cultivation techniques, there would definitely be disputes. When that happened, whoever was stronger would have the final say. In that case, both of their gazes turned to the people from Jiyan sect. Perfected Yuanmu naturally understood. With a sullen expression he said coldly, Fellow Taoists, what else can I say? Although their Jiyan sect was the strongest among the 5 groups, the others could defeat them if they joined forces. Scholar Yu smiled and didn't say anything. Although he had a good relationship with Perfected Yuanmu, he naturally had to join forces with the others to restrain Jiyan sect at this time. Mr. Yu is right. Supremacy Nameless, who had been silent all this while, spoke up. We entered this immortal palace in search of opportunities. It's best to prevent disputes. Besides, at our current cultivation realm, we can already create our own cultivation techniques. Even if we obtain the best cultivation techniques, we can't recultivate them. They will only benefit our descendants. Since that's the case, why be so calculative? Upon hearing this, Master Taoist Yuanmu's expression slowly eased. That's right. Although obtaining high-level cultivation techniques would be greatly beneficial to them, their chances of advancing to the deification realm weren't great. This benefit wasn't enough to make great late-stage nascent soul cultivators like them fall out with each other. He exhaled and slowly said, All right, this old man agrees as well. But his gaze turned to Emo Chenga and Qin Shi. Have you forgotten that little friend Emo is an exception? Sensing his killing intent, Qin Shi's aura turned cold. He took a step forward and stood in front of Emo Chenga. Master Taoist Yuanmu waved his hand and said, Fellow Taoist Qin, don't misunderstand. I don't mean anything else. It's just that we don't know which library these transporting formations lead to, but little friend Emo has the help of Senior Fu Yaozi's divine sense, so you know. Emo Chenga chuckled and said lightly, What's so difficult about that? Either we draw straws or you guys choose first. Isn't that enough? Chapter 468. Emo Chenga's attitude was so indifferent that everyone felt it was strange. Late nascent soul cultivators didn't mind, but she was only in the core formation realm. Although she was only a step away from the nascent soul realm, this step was like heaven and earth. How could she not care about the cultivation technique inside? But since she proposed this, no one objected because they felt they couldn't find any fault with it. Drawing lots was inevitable to lose the demeanor of a late nascent soul cultivator. In the end, everyone randomly chose a transporting formation. Repairing the transporting formation wasn't too difficult for the nascent soul cultivators. It only took them a little time to repair the relatively intact transporting formations, put spirit stones in them and teleported into them. It was only after everyone else impatiently left the transporting formation that Mo Chinga slowly put down the last spirit stone, then pulled Qinshi towards the transporting formation. A white light flashed and in an instant the two of them appeared in a strange room. This was a spacious hall, slightly smaller than the hall outside. On the top of the hall, there was a huge bead floating in the air, shining with a bright but gentle light, illuminating the windowless hall as if it were daytime. Inside the hall, there were neatly arranged purple-red bookshelves, emitting the fragrance of spirit wood. All kinds of books and jade slips were placed on the shelves, and there was a faint restrictive light on the surface of the bookshelves, which blocked divine sense. Mo Chinga looked up and said casually, "This bead is good. It's been so many years but it's still shining. If we take it back it'll be much better than moonstones." "Don't even think about it," Fu Yaozi said. "This bead is directly connected to the spirit vein here, which is why it hasn't been extinguished for more than 100,000 years. It'll be a waste if you take it." Mo Chinga wiped her sweat. She was just thinking about it casually. She sensed for a moment and didn't find any offensive restrictions around them. Feeling relieved, he turned around and asked, "Chinga, what are you planning? Which stacks are we in?" Mo Chinga showed a bitter smile and said, "Do you think I did it on purpose? In that situation what else could we do but retreat? They're all stronger than us." Qinshi was silent. If they really fought, he didn't think he was much worse than those late nascent soul cultivators. However, those people had lived hundreds or thousands of years longer than him and had rich experience in fights of magical powers. He wouldn't be able to gain an advantage. However, it's really not a big deal. She smiled and said, "Of the 5 book vaults, choosing the first 2 would be a great advantage, but we don't lack cultivation techniques. No matter which one we choose, we won't lose anything." Qinshi thought about it and agreed. Both of their cultivation methods were inherited from the ancient times and even the primordial era. Although they didn't have the content of the soul formation stage with their special constitutions, it wasn't practical for them to change to other cultivation methods. It was better to cultivate to the late nascent soul realm and create their own cultivation methods. Mo Chinga didn't immediately check the bookshelves. Instead, she turned around and laid a formation next to the transporting formation they just came from. This array was no ordinary trapping array. It was a killing array that was listed as one of the 10 most vicious arrays in the Xuanji array book. Even if a nascent soul cultivator were to enter, he would not be able to escape unscathed. She was not the only one who did this. The first thing the others did after entering the library was to set up defensive measures, lest someone went back on their word and followed them with malicious intent. While she was laying the formation, she walked forward and took a book from the purple-red bookshelf in the front. The books on this bookshelf were the lowest level aura refining cultivation techniques. Sensing their cultivation levels, the restrictions on the bookshelf didn't activate, allowing them to take the book away. Rudimentary pill concocting? Qinshi opened the book and looked up with a smile. "It seems we didn't get a good draw, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. Spells of the 5 elements, cultivation techniques, martial cultivation path, miscellaneous knowledge of pills and tools, and notes on experiences. Among these 5 categories, the book vault containing spells of the 5 elements and cultivation techniques was naturally the most valuable. Spells of the 5 elements were used in fights of magical powers, and cultivation techniques were related to the most fundamental cultivation and advancement, but the others weren't completely useless. Martial cultivation was a branch of cultivators. It was once glorious in the Middle Ages. Many Middle Ages sects had complete martial cultivation techniques, including sword cultivation, body cultivation, and so on. The value of this book vault was slightly lower than the other 2, but it was still quite useful. In the eyes of martial cultivators, this book vault was the most valuable. As for the other 2 categories, they seemed to be the least valuable at first glance, but they also had a chance to win the big prize. For example, notes on experiences, which recorded strange things in the cultivation world, illustrated books on spiritual treasures, and cultivation experiences of cultivators. If one could find a way to advance to the deification realm from these books, its value was likely to surpass the other 2. As for miscellaneous knowledge of pills and tools, it might be dispensable for other people. This was because many of the spiritual plants and objects that existed in the Middle Ages were already extinct today. Without raw materials, even if one knew the methods of pill concocting and tool refining, one couldn't cook a meal without rice. This was also the reason why many ancient pill recipes lost their value. In this book vault, perhaps the valuable books were the ones that recorded talisman techniques and formations, but these were all side paths and were of no help in advancing to the deification realm. However, these were all relative to other people. For the two of them it was completely different. Because Mo Chenga had the virtual sky world. There were many extinct spiritual plants in the virtual sky world. Because of the lack of pill recipes, Mo Chenga could only let them grow and die on their own and couldn't use them. Those rumored spiritual plants were easy for her to obtain, so it would be much easier to collect the spiritual plants required for these ancient pill recipes. Even if some supplementary materials were missing, with the amount of spiritual plants in the virtual sky world and the two of them, they could try to improve them. This immortal palace was a great ancient sect that might have a great ascension cultivator, so it was very likely that it had peerless pill recipes for advancing to the deification realm. If they could really find them, they would be priceless treasures. Mo Chenga already knew what was stored in this book vault. When everyone chose the transporting formation, Fu Yaozi already told her. After arranging the formation, he walked over. How is it? This ancient pill concocting technique is no different from today's, right? Qin read quickly and said with a smile, there's not much difference. However, although this book is only for beginners, it's very useful. There are some ancient books in the virtual sky world that we can't understand. This beginner's pill concocting book has detailed explanations for some basic techniques. That's a pleasant surprise. There were many ancient books left by the previous generation of cultivators in the virtual sky world, but because of the changes in the cultivation world, the two of them couldn't understand many of the contents. Even if they had pill recipes, they couldn't concoct some spiritual pills. Now, this beginner's pill concocting book just solved this fundamental problem. Upon discovering this, the two of them were overjoyed and began to immerse themselves in searching for useful books. The Jade slip from the administrative department of Buddhist texts said that all the books in this book vault couldn't be taken away and could be copied using identity cards. The number of ancient books that could be copied was also different according to one's cultivation level. They didn't have identity cards, and there were complicated restrictions in this book vault that couldn't be copied directly. This restriction was related to the foundation of this book vault, so it should have been set up by the cultivators with the highest cultivation levels in this great ancient sect. It wasn't something they could break with their cultivation levels. Therefore, they could only use the stupidest method, forcibly take away the useful books. In this way, they had to act according to their abilities. It was impossible to take away all the books because breaking the restrictions wasn't a simple matter. The two of them discussed for a while and decided to break the highest level books first. There wasn't only one room in the book vault. At the end, there was a small transporting formation. After putting down a spirit stone, they could enter the next room. The first room contained aura refining books, the second room contained foundation building books, and so on. According to Fu Yaozi, he once entered a deification realm room. Although they were only one realm apart, the difference in strength was like heaven and earth. The restrictions inside weren't something they could break, so they could only give up. Therefore, when they reached the room containing nascent soul secret books, the two of them stopped and Qin began to search. In the first room there were as many aura refining books as there was an ocean, but in the second and third rooms, there were fewer books. In the fourth room there were even fewer nascent soul books. Even so, it still took Qin more than an hour to go through all the ancient books and records. This trip wasn't in vain. Qin said to Mo Chenga with a happy expression after he withdrew his divine sense from a jade slip. Since he rarely showed such a happy expression, Mo Chenga asked, "What did you find?" Qin waved the jade slip in his hand and said, "This book is called Returning to Truth in Tao of Alchemy. It records the lifelong knowledge of an ancient master of alchemy, including pill concocting techniques and recipes for many miraculous pills. One of them is called the deification pill." Deification pill. Not only was Mo Chenga surprised, but Fu Yaozi on the Fuxing sword was also startled. "Qin," she said with a smile, "you should be able to understand the use of this pill from its name, right? When you cultivate to the peak of the late stage of the nascent soul realm and try to break through to the deification realm, it can help you form your soul." Mo Chenga calmed down and asked hurriedly, "What about the required spiritual plants?" Qin looked at it again and said hesitantly, "We can collect most of them, but there are some that we've never heard of." This was inevitable. No matter how many spiritual plants there were in the virtual sky world, it was impossible to collect all the spiritual plants in the world. Moreover, for a miraculous pill like the deification pill, the spiritual plants it needed must be rare treasures. There's no need to hurry. Not to mention that I haven't formed my nascent soul. Even for you, it's not easy to advance from the middle stage to the peak of the late stage. With our lifespans we have plenty of time to search slowly. And at that moment, Fu Yaozi sighed. I didn't expect there would be a pill recipe for the deification pill in this library. Unfortunately, the 5 of us were on guard against each other back then, so we couldn't check them one by one and missed it. The 2 of them were very satisfied after finding the pill recipe for the deification pill. Under Fu Yaozi's guidance, they spent another 4 hours to break the restrictions and take these books and jade slips from this room. Qin had consumed a lot of spiritual aura when he left the 4th room, so he had to adjust his breathing first. Fortunately, the spiritual pills Mo Chenga prepared were sufficient. It only took her less than an hour to almost fully recover. The 3rd room was filled with books for the core formation realm, so Mo Chenga could also help. Although there were many books, her speed was faster. Moreover, she was already familiar with the method of breaking the restrictions, so she only spent 2 hours. The first 2 rooms were even faster. Aura refining and foundation building realm books weren't of much use to them, so they only found a few basic ancient books before they left. Chapter 469. When they came out of the library, the hall was empty without a single person. This palace was extremely vast, with many buildings and complicated paths. Coupled with the overflowing primordial devil aura, it wasn't easy for others to find the scripture pavilion. It didn't take long for their group to reach this place. Mo Chenga and Qin had only stayed in the library for about 6 to 8 hours. Now that the passage to the celestial parting palace had been opened, it had only been a day, so it was impossible for other people to find this place. The others hadn't come out yet, so the 2 of them could only wait. They sat cross-legged and adjusted their breaths to restore their spiritual aura. Before long, the leftmost transporting formation lit up, and Ling Xiu of Juyin sect appeared. He was surprised to see the 2 people meditating on the side. Fellow Taoists, you came out so early? Seeing people coming out, the 2 of them stood up. Qin said, it's fellow Taoist Ling. What's wrong? You're done too? Ling Xiu nodded and calmly threw a talisman into the transporting formation. After a while, the others also appeared in the hall through the transporting formation. Mo Chenga saw this and secretly curled her lips. The people of Jian sect were really cautious. Ling Xiu's move was obviously because he was worried someone would set up an ambush outside, so he came out to check the situation first and only informed the people behind him to come out when there was nothing wrong. Among the 4 of them, Ling Yunhe was the most important. His cultivation level was low, and he was the master of the holy object, so no accident could happen to him. The other 2 were late-stage nascent soul cultivators and were their main fighting force. He was the least important person, so he came out to check the situation. In fact, they were a bit too cautious. The possibility of falling out now wasn't big. There was still a long way to go before they left the library, so what was this little benefit? However, Ling Yunfei once said that Juyin sect was different from other sects and valued friendship among fellow disciples the most. Looking at their behavior now, it should be true. Ling Xiu's move was to pave the way for his fellow disciples. If there was an accident, he would be the first to be sacrificed, but he seemed willing. Fellow Taoist Qin, little friend Mo, you 2 came out early. Master Taoist Yuanmu was surprised to see them. Qin, she said with a smile, we were unlucky. That library was of no value, so of course we came out early. Really? Master Taoist Yuanmu seemed to be in a very good mood, so he didn't say anything more. After a while, people came out of the other 3 transporting formations one after another. Some people were beaming with joy while others looked gloomy. However, everyone tacitly kept their mouths shut about which library they had chosen. Those who had won the lottery did not want to reveal their wealth, and those who were unlucky did not want to mention it. The matter of Scripture Pavilion was over. Everyone had their gains, so they continued to search for the library. Before he left, Perfected Yuanmu pondered for a moment and casually cast a spell to destroy the 5 teleportation arrays before leaving the Scripture Depository. Taoist Yuanmu and the Formation Sect. They had spent a lot of effort to come to the Sutra Depository Pavilion, but they had only obtained a few opportunities. If someone else came here by coincidence, they would not easily let them take away the treasures. In Yunzhong they were competitors. On the way back, the Ghostcraft Demon Lord suddenly asked, what happened to Mount Numinous back then? Sol the Lin's Sol, Emperor with realm, he with S mountain a with nascent Ling with nascence cultivators sect. Space cracks like this weren't the only place in the world, but it was rare to find a place as vast as Spirit Mountain that contained an entire sect. Moreover, this mountain was obviously the base of a big sect. Judging from its size, it had at least tens of thousands of disciples. However, after they entered, they didn't find any trace of other people except for some corpses that had become refined corpses. Mo Chinga paused for a moment before she said, Senior Fu Yaozi once speculated that this spiritual mountain was probably torn apart during the great changes in the world back then. At that time, the righteous path and the devil path were at war, and the human world collapsed. This great ancient sect also came to an end and only had a few disciples left. In the end, the world changed and they were buried here forever. Scholar Yu nodded and said, Senior Fu Yaozi's conjecture is very reasonable. Only a powerful force from the upheaval of heaven and earth could tear apart such a huge spirit mountain. At this point, he lightly tapped the folding fan in his hand and looked worried. He sighed and said, Look at this immortal palace on Spirit Mountain. Back then, this great ancient sect was so prosperous, but after the world changed, it turned into a dead city in the blink of an eye. In the eyes of the cultivators of this sect, we, the so-called top great cultivators, are insignificant. If we encounter the same thing one day, we'll be like ants, unable to even struggle. In the end, Scholar Yu's voice became so soft that it was almost inaudible. Among them, which one of them didn't go through hardships to cultivate to the late stage of the nascent soul realm? In the eyes of the world, they were unreachable great cultivators in the late stage of the nascent soul realm who had the ability to move mountains and drain seas. However, in front of the laws of heaven and earth, they were nothing more than ants, so insignificant that they weren't even worth mentioning. Influenced by Scholar Yu's tone, the great cultivators all fell silent. Everyone carried their own thoughts and walked forward in silence. Inside this immortal palace, there were restrictions laid by unimaginably high-level cultivators and primordial devil aura that leaked out of nowhere. If they just walked inside, it wouldn't be too dangerous. After all, this was a sect, not some dangerous place. The group of 12 people followed Mo Chinga for another half a day. They gradually left the pavilion and entered the mountain. When they could no longer see the pavilions, Mo Chinga finally stopped. Seniors, we've arrived. Upon hearing her voice, all the cultivators looked up with puzzled expressions. When they looked up, there was only an ordinary mountain wall in front of them. There were no buildings or traces of formations. However, with his experience in the Sutra Pavilion, Scholar Yu didn't immediately make a conclusion. Instead, he took out a formation plate and very carefully examined it before he turned to the others and said, It's an illusory formation. Upon hearing this, the others' expressions became solemn. They could more or less see some clues about the restrictions in the Sutra Pavilion, but this illusory formation, even with their cultivation levels, they couldn't sense it at all. How could they break it? Scholar Yu looked troubled. After thinking for a long time, he still couldn't think of a way to break it, so he could only turn his gaze to Mo Chinga. Little friend Mo, Senior 5 Saints once broke this illusory formation. Presumably, Senior Fu Yaozi knows how to break it. Little friend Mo, please consult Senior Fu Yaozi. Mo Chinga naturally had no reason to refuse this request. If she couldn't break this illusory formation, she wouldn't get any benefits. After Mo Chinga nodded in agreement, she stopped talking. Everyone knew she was communicating with Fu Yaozi, so they all waited quietly. After a while, Mo Chinga exhaled, looked up and said to Scholar Yu, Senior, this illusory formation is incomplete. Scholar Yu was surprised. We can't see through this illusory formation at all. It's actually incomplete? If that was the case, didn't that mean Senior 5 Saints' attainments and formations far surpassed theirs? Senior Fu Yaozi said this illusory formation was set up by an expert from this great ancient sect. If it was complete, we wouldn't be able to see through it. However, when Senior 5 Saints came here, he found that this illusory formation already had a loophole after a long time, so he discovered the existence of the storehouse. Hearing this, the others looked happy. It would have been fine if they didn't know about it, but now that they knew there was a storehouse here, they couldn't enter it. It was really like entering a treasure mountain only to return empty-handed. That would be too depressing. But before Scholar Yu could speak, Mo Chinga continued, Before we open the illusory formation, I'm afraid there are some things I have to clarify with seniors. Master Taoist Yuanmu narrowed his eyes and said in a deep voice, Little friend Mo and Senior Fu Yaozi, please don't hesitate to state your conditions. At this time, with such a tone, The people present weren't fools, so they already understood what she wanted to say. After entering the storehouse, there would almost certainly be friction between them. At that time, those who were weaker would suffer some losses. Emo Chenga, on the other hand, had offended them before. Now, although there were nascent soul cultivators by her side, her strength was inferior to theirs, so she naturally had to make a plan for herself. Of course, if her request wasn't too excessive, the great cultivators present wouldn't disagree. After all, she had put in a lot of effort along the way. If it wasn't for her, it would have been very difficult to find the scripture pavilion and the storeroom within 3 days. Emo Chenga said with a smile, "Seniors, I'm afraid you don't know, but this storehouse is a space-tearing technique. There's an independent space inside." "So, Scholar," you asked. "The special thing about this space is that it's very stable. The flow of spiritual aura is almost stagnant, so medicinal pills and other things can be preserved for a long time." Master Taoist Yuanmu's eyes lit up. "So, there might be intact ancient medicinal pills inside?" "Yes," Emo Chenga said. Emo Chenga said, "Back then when Senior 5 Saints entered, there were indeed intact medicinal pills. This was also one of their fated chances. However, the characteristics of this space led to another problem." Scholar Yu narrowed his eyes and pondered. All of a sudden he took a deep breath. "It seems Senior Yu has already thought of it." "Correct." Scholar Yu's tone was heavy. "The spiritual aura is almost stagnant, and the space is very stable. In that case, the restrictions inside the storehouse are probably intact." "Exactly." Emo Chenga sighed and said, "The storehouse must have been set up by the top great cultivators of this distant past cultivation group. If it's intact with our cultivation levels, we can't imagine what we can do." Upon hearing this, the others' expressions changed. In other words, even if they broke the illusory formation outside, they couldn't touch the restrictions inside the storehouse at all. "Little friend Emo," revered Wu Ming said with a smile, "since Senior 5 Saints could take the treasures from the storehouse back then, there must have been a loophole they could exploit, right?" "Correct." Upon hearing this, Master Taoist Yuanmu's expression became a little better. "But I wonder what method they used?" "It's very simple," Emo Chenga said, "to get the storehouse identity card." Chapter 470. Identity Tablet. Master Taoist Yuanmu muttered to himself. If they had the identity tablet, they would naturally be able to enter the storehouse unimpeded and would be safe. However, this distant past era's big sect had been destroyed for more than 100,000 years. Where would they get the storehouse identity tablet? Every important item like the storehouse identity tablet was either kept in an important place of the sect with layers of restrictions or in the hands of important figures. They didn't have the slightest clue about this. "Little friend Emo, do you mean you know where the storehouse identity tablet is?" Demon Monarch Guifeng asked. "Yes." Emo Chenga didn't hesitate and straightforwardly admitted it, but she didn't continue. Everyone present was smart. They knew this was her bargaining chip. If things were really as she said, this bargaining chip was too important. No matter who it was, they would definitely raise the price. If it was before, Emo Chenga wouldn't have the capital to raise any conditions under the suppression of absolute strength. But now, she also had powerful nascent soul cultivators behind her, so her weight was much greater. She also had the confidence to raise her conditions. At least this time, Yu Shuxing couldn't say, "What qualifications do you have to talk about conditions?" Master Taoist Yuanmu said in a deep voice, "Little friend Emo, if you have something to say, please speak frankly." In any case, the weight of these late nascent soul cultivators wasn't small. This junior wasn't a fool and wouldn't speak without thinking. As long as the conditions weren't too excessive, they could accept them. Emo Chenga smiled. "Seniors, please don't blame me. Junior is just a bit timid. Being together with seniors is very stressful." Yu Shuxing narrowed his eyes and closed his folding fan. He asked, "You want to enter the storehouse alone?" To be exact, Junior wants to be the first to enter the storehouse. Under the sharp gazes of the nascent soul cultivators, Emo Chenga remained calm and didn't shrink back. For a moment, the nascent soul cultivators didn't answer. Everyone looked pensive. The first person to enter the storehouse would get the best treasures. There was no need to say more about the benefits. If she was alone, her tone would have been a bit too arrogant, but with Qin Shi here, Master Taoist Yuanmu couldn't help but glance at Qin Shi. Qin Shi's expression was calm as if he didn't care, but he was standing in a very good position to protect Emo Chenga. Master Taoist Yuanmu furrowed his brows, feeling a headache. How could it be so coincidental that fellow Taoist Qin arrived just before they entered the mystic area? If it was like before, even if this little friend Mo had Fu Yaozi's divine sense protecting her, she wouldn't have dared to make such a request. Previously, she had also said that she only wanted a share of the pie. However, things were different now. Of course, if all of them joined forces, it wouldn't be difficult for a mid-nascent soul stage cultivator, no matter how powerful his divine abilities were. But the problem was, in the face of benefits, they had to keep each other in check. How could they possibly join forces? Besides, killing a nascent soul cultivator wasn't easy. If one couldn't kill a nascent soul cultivator as well, there would be no end of trouble in the future. Therefore, even if there was enmity between nascent soul cultivators, it was very restrained. Little friend Mo, your conditions are acceptable. Demon Monarch Guifeng was the first to speak. Apart from Mo Chenga and Qin Shi, his relationship with the other three teams was the most estranged. Even though they usually coexisted peacefully and Taoism, Buddhism and Confucianism were considered the righteous path after all, but at critical moments, they were still opposing his devil path. Under this kind of situation he was suppressed by the other three teams and was more inclined to side with Mo Tienga. After a short pause he continued to say, however, if you're the first to enter, all the treasures in this storehouse will be taken by you. Won't we be at a disadvantage? But this kind of bias also had to ensure their own benefits. That's right. Yu Shuxing also said coldly, this condition is too difficult to accept. Seniors, don't be in a hurry to refuse, Mo Tienga said calmly. To tell you the truth, seniors, storehouse tokens aren't omnipotent. Each token can only allow one person to enter and exit at a time. At most, they can only take away one treasure. Seniors, how many tokens do you think this junior can take? And how many treasures can I take? How could the seniors have nothing to take from the storehouse of such an ancient sect just because the juniors had taken a few treasures first? I'm afraid when the time comes, seniors won't know what to pick. Are you serious? Master Taoist Yuan Mu asked cautiously. If each token could only take one treasure, this condition wasn't that big of a deal. Just as she said, no matter how bad it was impossible for this great ancient sect's storehouse to only have one or two treasures that were pleasing to the eye. That's right. If Senior Yuan Mu doesn't believe me, we can verify it after we get the tokens. If things were really as Mo Chenga said, this condition wasn't so difficult to accept. This way the two of them wouldn't be able to take many treasures. At most, they would immediately flee after leaving the storehouse to ensure their own safety. As for setting up an ambush outside, presumably, they wouldn't do such a stupid thing in front of 5 late nascent soul stage cultivators. Alright, I have no objections. The first to speak was actually Yu Shuxing. He was actually able to let go. His expression was calm, without the slightest bit of unwillingness. Master Taoist Yuan Mu and Master Taoist Tai Mian glanced at each other then slowly nodded. Since both sides agreed, needless to say Venerable Wuming and Devil Monarch Guifeng naturally agreed. However, before Mo Chenga could speak, Devil Monarch Guifeng beat her to it and said, wait. Little friend Mo, apart from using the tokens, is there really no other way to deal with the restrictions in this storehouse? This sentence sounded very simple on the surface, but in fact, it contained another meaning. If she hid some kind of trick and was the first to enter, the two of them would take all the treasures and immediately flee after coming out. In that case, wouldn't all of them be fooled? Mo Chenga understood, so she answered, if seniors don't believe me, you can break the illusory formation and see if the restrictions in this storehouse are as I said. They're simply unbreakable. Seniors, you're all top-notch great cultivators in the human realm. Needless to say, your attainments and formations need not be mentioned. Even if the senior 5 saints back then were much more powerful than all of you, they still wouldn't be able to break through the restrictions of their realms. After hearing what she said, everyone was silent for a while. Mo Chenga's words weren't unreasonable. The gap between the nascent soul realm and the deification realm was very clear to these old monsters who had lived for thousands of years. The lower their realms, the smaller the gap between the two realms. With the help of treasures, aura refining cultivators might be able to compete with foundation building cultivators. A core formation cultivator, if they were talented enough, could also catch up with a nascent soul cultivator. However, the gap between the nascent soul realm and the deification realm was like heaven and earth. If the restrictions were for cultivators above the deification realm, they definitely wouldn't be able to break them. All right. Devil Monarch Guifeng muttered to himself for a while then said, I'll believe you this time. Everyone reached a consensus. Mo Chenga said, Senior 5 saints searched for ancient books and records in this sect. During the Great War between the righteous path and the devil path, The elders all had several storehouse tokens in their hands as rewards for their disciples. In the end, those elders couldn't escape the calamity and were buried in the immortal palace. We only need to find the corpses of the elders of this sect and we'll be able to find the storehouse tokens. How are we going to identify them? Yushusheng asked. Moreover, since they were elders, their cultivation levels must be outstanding. Those refined corpses we encountered earlier were at most in the nascent soul realm, but they were already so hard to deal with. If those elders also turned into refined corpses, Senior Fuyazi said that the immortals' caves of these elders were independent of the small peaks. Seniors, please take a look. Most of the independent peaks around us have immortals' caves of the elders. Mo Chinga paused for a moment then continued to answer. Junior doesn't dare to say that those elders didn't turn into refined corpses. However, this is definitely a minority. Seniors, you must know better than Junior how coincidental the formation of naturally refined corpses is. In short, if they happened to find elders who turned into refined corpses, they could only consider themselves unlucky. Master Taoist Yuan Mu nodded. It seems Senior Fuyazi already told little friend Mo about this. Presumably, based on this senior's character, he wouldn't play tricks on us, the younger generation from 100,000 years later. He then turned towards Mo Chinga. Little friend Mo, in that case should we split up and look for the tokens? Mo Chinga smiled and said, Junior doesn't dare to decide this. Seniors, you can do whatever you think is appropriate. Upon hearing what she said, the several nascent soul cultivators couldn't help but criticize her in their hearts. Along the way, did she not decide many things? Relying on Fuyazi's support, she didn't hesitate to order them around. Unfortunately, they didn't have much information, so they had to listen to her. Now that this matter was right in front of them, the more tokens they could find, the more treasures they could obtain. This was something they absolutely couldn't share with others. Their group had so many great cultivators with amazing divine abilities. If a dispute arose, it would be difficult to handle. Splitting up to look for tokens was the most suitable method. As for Mo Chinga, they already had no need to worry about her. If she had a way by herself, she wouldn't have brought so many people to the storehouse. At most, she would have just taken advantage of the situation. This was unavoidable. Who told her to have the best fated chance and run into Fuyazi? If she really obtained an amazing fated chance, it wouldn't be too late for them to make a move then. Everyone quickly reached an agreement. After asking about the characteristics of the tokens and setting a time to meet, they all left. Out of the 3 days, 1 day had already passed. There were only 2 days left. Everyone had their own thoughts, but they all tacitly agreed to stay for 1 day to deal with their personal matters, so they agreed to meet here 1 day later. Once the others were far away, She couldn't help but ask, Chinga, are you really? After being separated for 50 years, now that they met again, he realized he could no longer see through her thoughts at first glance, and he also didn't need to give her pointers one by one. In the past 50 years she had grown a lot. From her cultivation level to her behavior, she had the demeanor of a high-level cultivator. In front of these late nascent soul cultivators, she always maintained her composure and was neither servile nor overbearing. This was a good thing, he thought. The current Mo Chinga was only 1 step away from the nascent soul realm. As long as she advanced to the nascent soul realm, she would be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with him. As dual cultivation partners, the closer their cultivation levels were, the longer they could stay together. A mysterious smile appeared on Mo Chinga's face along with a rare playfulness. She winked at him and said, I didn't lie at all, but... She had to hold something back to live up to the fated chance given to her by the heavens. Who told her to be so lucky to obtain the life revival sword and Fuyazi's inheritance? Then what are we going to do next? He asked. He was very curious about what she was hiding. Of course we're going to look for tokens. Mo Chinga smiled. I'm telling the truth. Chapter 471. It was easy to say but difficult to find the tokens for the storehouses in the Immortals' caves on the surrounding small peaks. Because there were Immortals' caves on the small peaks, it wasn't hard to find them. Although there weren't many cultivators who entered the Immortal Palace, there were still a lot of them. If they ran into each other, there would inevitably be some conflicts. In the face of fated chances, the friendship of inviting them to a grand meeting was not worth mentioning. Besides, the 3 groups had been forced to announce the secret space in the Sea of Returning Ruins. How could those old and shrewd cultivators be grateful to them? Previously, when they entered the Immortal Palace, they had already given them face. As he followed the 3 elders, Ling Yunhe pondered for a long time and finally asked, martial uncle's great-grandfather, do you really believe what fellow Taoist Mo said? Upon hearing his question, Master Taoist Yuanmu tilted his head to look at him and said meaningfully, "You've finally lived up to our expectations of you by asking this question." Ling Yunhe was startled. Seeing this, Ling Xiu patted his shoulder with a smile and said to Master Taoist Yuanmu, "Senior martial brother Yuanmu, there's no need to worry about my boy's Tao heart." Master Taoist Yuanmu also smiled but didn't say anything. He said to Ling Yunhe gently, "Cultivation is not easy. At our realm we have to cherish our lives even more. Even if there are benefits in front of us, we have to make trade-offs." That junior might not have nothing to hide, but as she said, with her realm in front of her, there are some things she can't deceive even if she wanted to. Without real benefits, there's no need to push her too hard. After all, she's not alone now. "Besides, you know what our biggest goal is?" Master Taoist Iron Mask said indifferently. Ling Yunhe was slightly startled, but then he nodded cautiously. Decades ago, when the Heavenly Demon Tower appeared, he already knew what kind of secret the Juyin sect's founder left behind. Later, when the 5 holy objects appeared one after another and he obtained the Soul Restraining Pearl's recognition, he finally entered the core of Juyin sect as a core formation cultivator. The matter of the Sea of Returning Ruins couldn't be lost. The fated chance left behind by the founder was related to the rise and fall of Juyin sect for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. It was precisely because he knew how important this matter was that he very well put away his petty thoughts and simply stood in the position of the Juyin sect's leader to handle matters. He had thought that no one would know about his little thoughts, but it turned out that even the elders knew about it. He could honestly admit that after their trip to Carefree Valley that year, he already regarded Mo Chenga in a new light, so he didn't want to oppose her and tried his best to leave her a way out. But that was all. This was a strange feeling. He had once thought about it carefully. Perhaps the title of genius that he had carried on his back since he was young was too heavy. Even his best friends and closest brothers were unable to share his burden and even turned against him in the end. Mo Chenga, on the other hand, was very sharp and reliable. She could always see everything clearly, but she never said anything. Just as he had said, she was a person who could not be bullied. She was a safe person, a person who could make him relax. If she had been a man, he would certainly have taken her as a confidant, but she was not, so he began to have some ideas. This was because the path of cultivation was too lonely. Regardless of whether it was a close friend or a Tao companion, they were both rare and precious. However, a close friend would not last as long as a Tao companion. However, all of this was not important. It was not only because she already had a Tao companion, but also because he realized that there was a difference between them in the end. Ling Yunhe was now the head of Juyin sect. In the future he would be the pillar of Juyin sect. He had to support the sect and lead countless disciples. As for Mo Chenga, she might also have an illustrious master in the distant outer endless sea, but obviously even if she had a master, she was more inclined to pursue the path to immortality. Therefore, on the path to immortality she walked faster and more freely than he did. After understanding this, he felt relieved. They were not suitable people even without Qin Shoujing. His little thoughts were because he was lonely, but on the path of cultivation who wouldn't be lonely? What he needed was to cultivate his mental state, not to find a Tao companion. Thinking of this, Ling Yunhe smiled softly. Perhaps, from another perspective, he should thank Mo Chenga. This feeling of sudden enlightenment made his mental state have a breakthrough. Now that things had come to this, Mo Chenga might not necessarily be unable to be friends with him, but there was no need to force her. If there were no conflicts of interest on this trip, maybe when they met again in the future they could be bosom friends, but if there were conflicts, Master Taoist Yuanmu, who was about to fly to a lone peak, suddenly stopped and frowned. Someone's here. At this time, Mo Chenga and Qin Shi were running on the mountain road. Their destination was obviously not those immortals' caves built on independent peaks. In this immortal palace, there weren't many lone peaks suitable for building immortals' caves, and every one of them was very obvious, so there would definitely be people fighting for them. The temporary passage to enter the immortal palace was very dangerous. Not many cultivators could pass through, but at least those in the late nascent soul stage were included. In addition to Master Taoist Yuanmu and the others, there were also 6 late nascent soul cultivators, as well as other middle stage or early stage nascent soul cultivators with amazing divine powers. There were more than a dozen groups. After entering the immortal palace, most of these groups, except for those who were unlucky, could find these lone peaks. An independent peak with a good spiritual aura was obviously a suitable place to build an immortal's cave. How could these nascent soul cultivators miss it? Ancient cultivators' immortals' caves had always been places of fated chances, let alone an immortals' cave that could occupy a peak in a great ancient sect. Therefore, unless it was absolutely necessary, Mo Chenga wasn't willing to wade in these muddy waters. We're here. Upon hearing the sound, Qin stopped and looked up, only to discover a desolate precipice in front of him. On the precipice, there were densely packed cave entrances every few hundred feet. Next to them was a towering rock engraved with several ancient characters. Ascetic Cliff. This is. He hesitated. Based on the name, it seemed to be a special immortals cave for disciples to do closed-door meditation. Every decent cultivation group had an immortals cave like this. Shenqing School had one, and even Yunwu sect had one back then. Because low-level disciples didn't have good immortals caves, they needed a lot of spiritual aura when they wanted to do closed-door meditation, so their usual living quarters weren't enough. Therefore, the cultivation group opened an adjacent immortals cave for low-level disciples to rent during closed-door meditation. Compared to the living quarters of low-level disciples, this kind of immortals cave naturally had much better spiritual aura, but it still couldn't compare to the independent immortals caves of high-level cultivators. According to reason, there shouldn't be high-level cultivators in this kind of place, and it was naturally impossible for them to have a storehouse identity tablet. This way. Mo Tienga didn't pay attention to him and went along the small path on the side. There was a simple and crude hut halfway up the mountain. It should be the residence of the cultivator guarding this immortals cave, and it was also the location of the protective formation. An immortals cave for low-level disciples like this wouldn't be protected by very good formations. Besides, after so many years, it had long been dilapidated. Mo Chenga effortlessly erased the formation in this place without using any tricks. She then went up the precipice with Qin Shi. Back then, Master Fu Yaozi obtained several ancient cultivators' Chengkuan bags in the Immortal Palace and learned about this ascetic cliff from them. The spiritual aura on this cliff is indeed ordinary, but there are several spiritual eyes at the top of the cliff. At first, no one knew about these spiritual eyes, but later on, they were discovered and developed into high-level special immortals caves. Only elders and above can use them, Mo Chenga explained to him as they walked. Spiritual eyes were the few spots on a spirit vein where the spiritual aura was most concentrated. In the cultivation world, people generally believed that spirit veins were actually spiritual aura areas formed from the spiritual aura of one or several spiritual eyes. In other words, only with spiritual eyes could spirit veins form, and spiritual eyes were the center of spirit veins. However, spiritual eyes weren't that easy to find. The spiritual aura on spirit veins varied in intensity and intensity. Spiritual eyes usually existed in spots with particularly dense spiritual aura, but they couldn't be sensed as long as they were several hundred feet away from them. Therefore, not all spiritual eyes could be found. Occasionally, there would be extremely lucky middle-level disciples who accidentally found a place with spiritual eyes when they were developing their immortals caves. I see. Qin Shi nodded lightly, then he frowned and asked, "You said this sect had already declined when this spiritual mountain was torn into an independent space, and it was also the time of the war between the righteous and the devil. Are there elders and closed-door meditation in this special immortals cave?" "Yes, we can only rely on our luck." Mo Chenga sighed. "If there are elders and closed-door meditation, we can smoothly find the storehouse token. If there aren't any, we can only go to those elders' immortals caves and compete with them." This was a choice. They had no other choice. They didn't want to have conflicts with other people. After all, this was Yunzhong, not the celestial pole. Those who could enter Immortal Palace were all top nascent soul cultivators. They still had to deal with Master Taoist Yuan Mu and the others, so it wasn't wise to waste their strength on other people. The two of them went straight to the top of the precipice. A moment later, they saw an independent immortals cave on the top. Qin Shi looked up and was surprised. "There are actually 3 spiritual eyes here?" There were 3 immortals caves on this precipice. The 2 immortals caves were separated by several miles, so the number of spiritual eyes was quite high. And it's really incredible. The spiritual aura on this spiritual mountain was so strong that it wasn't strange to have many spiritual eyes, but it was very rare to have 3 spiritual eyes in such a small area. The 2 of them didn't delay. As they talked, they arrived in front of the first immortals cave. Since this immortals cave could only be used by high-level cultivators in the cultivation group, the formation outside the door naturally couldn't be as useless as before. However, after all, tens of thousands of years had passed, and the individual defensive formations had long lost their effectiveness due to the exhaustion of spirit stones. Only some special restrictions existed as long as there was spiritual aura here. Mo Chenga took out a compass and other things to determine the yin, yang, and 5 elements of this place. After a while she frowned. What's wrong? She asked with concern. Is it very hard to crack? Mo Chenga put down the compass, her expression alternating between joy and worry. This restriction is more like a mechanism than a formation. It seems there's a technique of mechanisms in this great ancient cultivation group. Technique of mechanisms? Shi was shocked. He naturally knew what the technique of mechanisms was. It was a unique skill that used various spiritual objects and crystals to make puppets or machines with exquisite means to obtain power similar to that of human cultivators. At first glance, the technique of mechanisms was very similar to the technique of puppetry. However, the technique of puppetry in the cultivation world was like refining corpses. It required living people or living creatures. Moreover, to control a puppet, one's own strength must be higher than the puppet's. The technique of mechanisms was different. It didn't require living creatures. Even if it lost its master, it could still be preserved in good condition. Furthermore, it didn't have any requirements for strength. Chapter 472. Girl, is this really the art of mechanisms? Fu Yaozi was pleasantly surprised to hear what she said. Mo Chenga pondered for a moment then answered, Disciple isn't sure, but based on my understanding of formations and restrictions, this definitely isn't an ordinary restriction. I can only say that it's somewhat similar to the art of mechanisms. Then quickly give it a try, Fu Yaozi urged. If we can get the art of mechanisms from this place, it'll be a pleasant surprise. Back when she was in the foundation building realm, Mo Chenga once witnessed the wonders of the art of mechanisms in Wanderer Ziwei's Immortal's Cave. She also obtained 2 foundation building puppets from Wanderer Ziwei, so she knew the wonders of this ancient technique. Now, even without Fu Yaozi's instructions, she was already very excited. After she finished testing the restrictions yin, yang, and 5 elements, Mo Chenga put away the compass, took out the 8 trigrams diagram from her sleeve, and threw it towards the entrance of the cave. The 8 trigrams diagram stopped in the middle of the restriction then slowly unfolded, creating ripples of light that smoothed out the spiritual aura in the surroundings. Once the spiritual aura calmed down, Mo Chenga stretched out her hand, and the 8 trigrams diagram flew back into her sleeve. Now that she examined the restriction again, she could see it much more clearly than before. The yin, yang, and 5 elements were no longer fluctuating, so it was much easier to distinguish whether it was the art of mechanisms or not. It's strange. I feel like there's a spiritual aura fluctuation similar to that of a cultivator, but there's no puppets or anything else. The reason why the art of mechanisms was hard to distinguish was because it might only be a few simple mechanisms that weren't made to look like humans or beasts. In addition, Mo Chenga's knowledge of this technique was limited, so she couldn't tell whether this was an art of mechanisms or a restriction that far surpassed her realm. Seeing her hesitate for a long time, she said, Let me try. Right after he finished speaking, he took a step forward, put his hand into his Chengkuan bag, and took out the mountain-determining lantern. The mountain-determining lantern looked unremarkable. It had an old green color, a dark gray texture, and a simple design. It looked like a simple green lamp that had been burned in front of a Buddha statue in the secular world for dozens of years. It was gray, but if one looked carefully, one would notice that there were fine lines engraved inside the lantern, forming a wonderful formation that faintly emitted pure spiritual aura. The mountain-determining lantern flew up. As soon as it touched the restriction, it emitted light. At first it was just a small green lamp, but gradually the mountain-determining lantern became brighter and brighter. Mo Chenga could see that these 2 forces were contending against each other. Qin Shi's peak-setting lantern was also a rare magic weapon. Magic weapons that could break restrictions were rare to begin with. Besides, this was a spiritual treasure he found in a secret place, so it was a top-grade magic weapon. Therefore, although he wasn't proficient in formations with this lantern, ordinary restrictions couldn't stop him at all. The peak transcendent lantern shone brightly. The spiritual qi in the seal began to tremble as if it would be repelled in the next moment. Suddenly there was a buzzing sound. The spiritual qi surged and formed a light screen, blocking the peak transcendent lantern. Upon seeing this, Qin Shi formed an incantation gesture. The peak-determining lantern suddenly spun, driving the spiritual aura in the surroundings to form a vortex that collided with the light screen. Qi. A sharp tearing sound was heard. The light screen shook a little and several ripples appeared on it. Seeing this, the 2 of them looked delighted. She directed the mountain-determining lantern to crash into the light screen even more attentively. After several collisions, a loud boom was heard. Under the impact of the peak transcendent lantern, the light screen suddenly broke. The light screen flickered then disappeared in a flash. It's done. Chenga was about to step forward when she suddenly felt a spiritual aura fluctuation. She instinctively sensed danger, so she took a step back. Muffled sounds of friction were heard at the same time. 2 huge stone balls flew out from both sides of the Immortal's cave and attacked the peak transcendent lantern. She was startled. He formed an incantation gesture and the peak transcendent lantern immediately flew back. It brushed past the 2 stone balls and fell into his hand. With a loud boom, the 2 stone balls collided. Stone fragments flew everywhere, causing the spiritual aura in the surroundings to fluctuate continuously. A wave of chi rolled towards the 2 of them. This wave of chi was also a spiritual aura attack. Shi waved his sleeve and the sword aura of the 3 young real fire sword formed a formation, repelling the wave of chi. When the wave of chi dissipated, there was still a light screen in front of the Immortal's cave. Chenga and Shi stood in front of the Immortal's cave, looking at each other in dismay. After a long time, Chenga finally muttered to herself, "The art of mechanisms. It's really the art of mechanisms." The 2 stone balls weren't made of ordinary stones. They were a rare stone called broken jade stone, which was extremely hard. In today's world, even if it was only the size of a fist, it was still a refining material that cultivators would crazily fight over at trade fairs. However, in this ancient cultivator's Immortal's cave, this broken jade stone was actually made into such huge stone balls. It was really a waste of natural resources. She exhaled and put away the peak transcendent lantern. He said, "This is the first time I've seen this kind of restriction. We've obviously succeeded in breaking the restriction, but there's still a backup plan." Chenga frowned and said, "This restriction has 2 layers. The outer layer is a formation restriction based on yin, yang, and 5 elements. Once this layer is broken, the art of mechanisms behind it will be activated and repel the enemy. After that, the restriction will repair itself." At this point she patted her head. "This is going to be difficult. I don't have the slightest clue as to how to break the restriction." One day they only had 1 day. If they couldn't get the storehouse command tablet in 1 day, the treasures in the storehouse would have nothing to do with them anymore. If they didn't have the confidence to break the restriction in this period of time, they might as well go to the Elder's Immortal's cave and compete with others. Chenga turned to Shi in distress. "What should we do? Should we try our best here or give up and go to another Immortal's cave?" Shi deliberated for a while. Just as he was about to speak, his eyes suddenly lit up. "Look, this restriction." Chenga once again looked towards the entrance of the Immortal's cave. She was pleasantly surprised. This. Just now the restriction seemed to have been restored, but that wasn't the case. In just a short while the light curtain had weakened a lot. All right. Chenga suddenly understood. Self-restoring restrictions usually repair themselves slowly over a long period of time. It's impossible for them to restore all their power in an instant. In fact, the outer layer of the restriction was already broken by the peak transcendent lantern. The one that was restored later was just to fool us. As she spoke, she once again took out her compass. Right now, this restriction hasn't recovered much of its power, so it won't be difficult to break it. As for this mechanism technique, it doesn't seem to be very powerful. Seeing that she was once again focused on breaking the formation, she smiled and sat cross-legged on the side, regulating his breath and keeping his guard up. The peak transcendent lantern had broken the first restriction, but its subsequent restoration couldn't be considered very powerful. At the very least, it hadn't broken through to the nascent soul realm. Chenga pondered for a long time, then took out a bunch of formation-breaking tools from her bosom. Several formation flags formed a formation diagram at the entrance of the Immortal's cave. When the last formation flag was inserted, Chenga made a hand seal. The formation flags suddenly lit up and eventually formed a light ball. Soon after she let out a soft shout. The light ball flew up and hit the light curtain. Swish. This time there wasn't even a stalemate. The light curtain was broken without a sound. After waiting for a while, the subsequent mechanism technique didn't activate and the restriction wasn't restored immediately. Chenga heaved a sigh of relief. The first layer can be considered broken. She had already stopped regulating his breath when she started breaking the restriction. At this moment he asked, "What about the next mechanism? Do you have any ideas?" Mo Chinga pondered for a moment then said, I don't know much about the mechanism technique so I can only use the stupid method. She took out the 2 stone sculpture dolls from her Chinkuan bag and used her divine sense to control them, then walked towards the immortal's cave. These 2 dolls were given to her by Wanderer Ziwei. They were also made using the mechanism technique, but their realms were a bit low. All these years, they'd been handling the miscellaneous matters in the immortal's cave for her. The advantage of using these 2 dolls was that they were incomparably sturdy and had no consciousness. Even if they were broken, she could still repair them when she learned the mechanism technique in the future. If she used other living creatures to test them, for example, those 3 spiritual beasts, she reckoned they wouldn't be able to return. The 2 dolls walked step by step into the restriction. When they touched the spot where the stone ball rolled out, a faint cracking sound was heard. Suddenly, 2 shiny wooden hands emerged from the stone walls on both sides of the immortal's cave and grabbed the 2 dolls. Just as Mo Chinga was about to make the dolls dodge, she discovered that the 2 hands moved extremely fast and grabbed the dolls' necks in an instant. The 2 dolls immediately brandished the stone swords in their hands, wanting to chop off the arms. However, with a clang, the stone swords chopped into the 2 arms and broke into 2 pieces. This time, Qinshi couldn't sit still anymore. These 2 hands seemed to be made of wood, but they were actually even harder than the dolls' stone swords. He knew that although these 2 dolls were only in the foundation building realm, the materials they were made of were extraordinary. Even ordinary magic weapons would have a hard time injuring them. Mo Chinga was stunned for a moment. She watched as the 2 hands exerted force and the stone sculpture dolls broke into 2 pieces, separating their heads from their bodies. After the 2 dolls were severed, the 2 hands retracted back into the stone walls and disappeared without a trace. After a while, Mo Chinga finally regained her senses. She sighed and used her spiritual aura to roll the 2 corpses into her Chinkuan bag. She didn't expect that these 2 dolls, who'd been with her for so long, would be so easily destroyed. Don't be stupid. At that moment, Fu Yaozi's voice rang in her mind. The so-called mechanism technique is used to make dolls and instruments that have the same cultivation level as cultivators. Furthermore, the higher the level, the rarer the materials used. Those 2 dolls of yours are only in the foundation building realm. Isn't it ridiculous to use them to test them? Mo Chinga was stunned for a moment before she started to understand. In the past, she relied on the fact that the 2 dolls were made of special materials and were difficult to damage, so she often used them to test formations. However, she forgot that formations only had spiritual aura fluctuations caused by yin, yang, and 5 elements. Mechanisms, on the other hand, had physical bodies like dolls. Master. She felt very ashamed. Then in your opinion, how should I break these mechanisms? Fu Yaozi chuckled. Have you forgotten that 1 strong man can defeat 10 skillful men? Mo Chinga was stunned for a moment before she suddenly understood. Thank you for your guidance, Master. In the past few days, she'd been either breaking restrictions or dealing with other people. She'd been using her brain too much. In the cultivation world, what did they rely on to win? Strength, of course. In front of absolute strength, any kind of skill was useless. Whether it was the stone balls at the beginning or the wooden hands later, their strength didn't surpass the nascent soul realm. That being the case, she could just directly break through them. Why would she need to use her brain? Thinking up to this point, she turned to Qin Shi and said with a smile, Senior Marshal Brother, it's up to you. Chapter 473. The 3 Yang Real Fire Sword transformed into sword auras and formed a formation, emitting a powerful aura. Qin Shi refined this sword when he first formed his gold core and kept it in his dantian for nearly 200 years. He also often refined it with precious materials, so its power was extraordinary. Hundreds of streaks of sword chi swept towards the stone door with an astonishing aura. With a loud boom, the 2 stone balls on the stone walls on both sides of the cave once again rolled out, but they were struck down by the sword auras one after another. Seeing this scene, Mo Chinga secretly sighed in relief. Fortunately, this mechanism wasn't too advanced. With Qin Shi's strength, breaking it was only a matter of time. After the stone balls, there was a wooden hand. It was unknown what this wooden hand was made of, but even Qin Shi's sword aura couldn't cut it. In the end, he had to use the extreme Yang Real Fire to break it. This went on for about 2 hours. In the end, Qin Shi once again brandished his sword aura. Finally, without any obstruction, it hit the stone door of the immortal's cave. With a boom, the stone door opened, revealing its true appearance. The 2 of them looked at each other with joy. After tossing and turning here for several hours, they finally didn't waste their time and energy in vain. I'll go in first. Qingshi turned around and said. With a wave of his sleeve, the sword aura returned to his side and formed a formation. Then he carefully stepped into the cave. Emo Chenga watched nervously. Since this cave dwelling could only be used by high-grade cultivators of the sect, it was possible that there were existences that far surpassed their cultivation levels. For example, if the restrictions outside the cave dwelling were to be activated again, it would be more than enough to deal with. Fortunately, nothing happened after Qingshi went in and looked around. He said to her, I'm fine. Come in. Emo Chenga breathed a sigh of relief, but she still didn't dare to relax. She operated the art of primordial origin and used the white silk handkerchief to protect herself before stepping inside. After entering the cave, she turned around and looked around. This cave was simple but not lacking in atmosphere. The hall was spacious and there were only a few stone tables and chairs for receiving guests. There were also moonstones embedded in the walls, but they had long lost their effectiveness. There was a smaller stone door around it which should lead to a cultivation room. This immortal's cave is temporarily rented by their high-level cultivators, and it's also inside the sect, so there shouldn't be too many restrictions, Emo Chenga said after looking at it for a while. Qingshi nodded. If this was a high-level cultivator's private immortal's cave, it would definitely be heavily protected, but this was a public immortal's cave, so the situation was different. Who would bother to set up layers of restrictions in a temporarily rented cave abode? Furthermore, it was in an important area of the sect. Normally they would just set up their own array formation. The furnishings in the hall could be seen at a glance, and there was nothing else. The two turned their attention to the training room. They weren't sure if there were any high-level cultivators cultivating in the cave abode. If there weren't any in the cultivation room, then the few hours they spent here would have been in vain. I'll do it. Qingshi was still in the lead. Under normal circumstances, cultivators would lay down a defensive array outside the cave abode, and then lay down a restriction around the cultivation room just in case. If Gu Xiuxiu was really in seclusion in the cultivation room when the spirit mountain was torn apart, then he would most likely have set up a restriction. Emo Chenga knew she wasn't strong enough, so she didn't object and followed behind him. Several sword auras were shot out, and the stone door of the cultivation room was instantly smashed into pieces. In the middle of the red light, several white lights flashed and attacked outside with a powerful momentum. Qingshi was shocked. He raised his hand and a white light shield appeared in front of him. At the same time he dodged the white lights. TSS TSS TSS. Multiple black arrows struck the opposite stone wall, almost shattering it into pieces. Emo Chenga's face turned pale. When she turned around and saw that Qingshi had dodged safely, she calmed down a little. Is this also a mechanism technique? Qingshi withdrew his sword aura and turned around to ask. Most likely. Emo Chenga walked to the stone wall that was almost pierced through, picked up a black arrow and looked at it for a while. Then she was pleasantly surprised. Black gold. Black gold? Qingshi also walked over, took the black arrow and weighed it in his hand. Extreme young real fire sprang out of his palm and burned it for a while, but the black arrow didn't change at all. He said happily, sure enough it's black gold. It's the best material for forging swords. When it came to refining tools he was much more proficient than Emo Chenga, so he didn't need to explain how to distinguish black gold. The broken jade outside, the two wooden hands and this black gold. Even if we didn't find the identity tablet, this trip was still worthwhile, Qingshi said with a smile. Emo Chenga nodded. Not to mention the wooden hands, they couldn't even tell what kind of material they were. The broken jade and black gold were both from the distant past era, and they were almost impossible to find in the current cultivation world. They only occasionally appeared in high-level cultivators' trade fairs, and usually only a small piece of them would be crazily snatched. However, since there are restrictions here, it's very likely that there are cultivators in closed-door meditation here. She put away the black arrows one by one and returned to the door of the cultivation room. Fortunately, this mechanism technique isn't complete. It's the only test. Wait. Before she stepped into the cultivation room, Qingshi stopped her and said, I'll go in first. Emo Chenga hesitated for a moment, but in the end she nodded and stepped back. In the face of possible dangers, Qingshi always paved the way for her, so she was moved. However, she hadn't formed her nascent soul yet, so it was a fact that she was weaker than him. Rather than trying to be brave, she'd better be obedient. Seeing that she was obedient, Qingshi showed a reassuring smile, activated the sword formation, and walked towards the cultivation room. When he stepped into the cultivation room's stone door, he paused for a moment, but there was no movement. He looked around and was instantly shocked. Tienga. Mo Tienga didn't see any restrictions or mechanisms, so when she heard his voice, she followed him inside. What? She was just about to ask what was going on, but she was also stunned. This cultivation room's layout was also simple. There was only a stone bed, and a skeleton wearing a white robe was sitting cross-legged on it. The strange thing was that the skeleton's bones were neither black nor white. They were as transparent as crystal. What's going on? She stared at the skeleton in a daze. After a cultivator passed away, their physical body would turn into spiritual aura and dissipate, and their bones would gradually turn black with time until they turned into a pile of black ash. But not only was this skeleton preserved for tens of thousands of years intact, but it was also as transparent as crystal, which was simply unheard of. She cautiously approached it, turned the three-yang real fire sword into its original form, and poked the white robe covering it with the sword. The skeleton fell down with a single poke. With a crashing sound, it instantly collapsed into a pile of bones of various sizes. Seeing this, she withdrew the three-yang real fire sword, feeling puzzled. This white robe was obviously a rare spiritual treasure. It was still well preserved after tens of thousands of years, and its surface was smooth without the slightest wrinkle. Moreover, the body of the three-yang real fire sword was covered in real fire, but it didn't affect it in the slightest. Presumably, this skeleton was an elder-level figure of this distant past cultivation group, so it wasn't strange for it to have such a spiritual treasure. Mo Chenga thought for a moment, then took out a pair of gloves made of natural worm silk from her chinkuan bag and walked forward. Be careful. She warned her. This skeleton is so abnormal, I don't know if I can touch it. Don't worry. Mo Chenga waved her hand. These gloves aren't even afraid of primordial devil aura, so they should be fine. After Nya Wushang swallowed primordial devil, she wore these gloves and came into contact with them so they wouldn't corrode. Mo Chenga picked up a bone and examined it carefully. This bone was obviously no longer made of bone, but it wasn't made of gold or jade, and of course, it wasn't made of real crystal either. It was extremely strange. She knocked it and the bone made a crisp sound. She then tried to break it, but it didn't change in the slightest. The two of them couldn't figure out what was going on, so Mo Chenga couldn't help but ask Fu Yaozi, "Master, have you ever heard that after a cultivator dies, their bones will become as transparent as crystal?" After a while, Fu Yaozi finally said, "What? Crystal-like bones? Master, you don't know? What were you doing just now?" Mo Chenga was surprised. This master had always been paying attention to the surrounding situation, so why didn't he know what was happening outside this time? Fu Yaozi paused for a moment, then said, "Master's divine sense is a bit weak, so I was just resting." Mo Chenga was shocked to hear this. "Master, at most I'll be able to hold on for a month or so before my divine sense dissipates," Fu Yaozi said faintly. "Alright, let me see what's going on." Mo Chenga felt the Fuxing sword's divine sense flowing out and circling around the crystal bone. After a long time it finally withdrew. From what I can see, the reason why this person's bones are abnormal after he died should be because he cultivated a kind of strange cultivation technique. Cultivation technique? Correct, Fu Yaozi said. Look around and see if there are any storage-type magic weapons in the surroundings. Mo Chenga swept her gaze around and saw a simple and unadorned silver ring on the skeleton's hand. She put the bone down and took off the silver ring. An Chinkuan ring? She looked happy to see this item. Legend has it that Chinkuan rings were storage-type magic weapons used by ancient cultivators and were much more advanced than Chinkuan bags. Unfortunately, the method of refining them has long been lost. I didn't expect to see the real thing today. The method used to refine Chinkuan rings is the space-tearing technique, so they're also called Shumi rings. How can Chinkuan bags compare to them? Fu Yaozi said after hearing Shi's words. Unfortunately, Shi couldn't hear him. Mo Chenga tried to pour her spiritual aura into the Chinkuan ring and easily opened it. A pile of things came out with a clattering sound. Don't. Fu Yaozi stopped her too late. The things were already piled up, so Mo Chenga hastily cut off her spiritual aura and closed the Chinkuan ring. Fu Yaozi sighed. Think about it. Which high-level cultivator doesn't carry several Chinkuan bags with them? If all the things in these Chinkuan bags were put into Chinkuan rings, how many would there be? If you pour them out like this, I'm afraid you'll fill the whole room. Mo Chenga scratched her head. She knew she did something stupid again. Wasn't Shi here? Of course she wanted to pour them out and look at them together. But you guys really made a profit. Since this skeleton is an elder-level figure of this big ancient cultivation group, he's at least in the deification realm. You guys really became rich overnight after obtaining his Chengquan ring. Fu Yaozi was both envious and jealous. Master also saw an Chengquan ring back then, but it was divided among 5 people. Mo Chinga smiled and said, although Master only got 1/5 of it, he entered the deification realm in one go. Why are you still jealous of us? Fu Yaozi snorted and didn't say anything. Looking at the pile of things on the ground, Mo Chinga pulled Qin Shi and said, Senior Marshal Brother, quickly look around and see if there are any identity tablets. Chapter 474. The two of them buried their heads and searched for a while. Sure enough, they found 3 pitch-black tokens. The tokens were made of neither gold nor wood, and there were faint strange restrictions on them. This is it, Fu Yaozi said, you're lucky to find 3 of them at once. Mo Chinga didn't expect things to go so smoothly. They found tokens in their first cave, and there were 3 of them at that. She said happily, thank you for your guidance, Master. Fu Yaozi didn't say anything. Maybe he was even more jealous. When he and the other 4 people entered the Immortal Palace, they went through a lot of trouble to get 1 token. They were lucky to get the treasures of an ancient cultivator without any harm. After putting away the tokens, the 2 of them roughly counted the items in the universe ring. The ancient cultivator who turned into a crystal skeleton was indeed a deification cultivator. There were many treasures beyond the nascent soul realm in the interspatial ring. Unfortunately, too much time had passed, so the spiritual herbs and medicinal pills had long lost their medicinal properties. Fortunately, the interspatial ring was independent and the spiritual aura was stagnant, so most of the refining materials and magic weapons were intact. These are all high-grade spirit stones. Qin Shi picked up a spirit stone bag. Ancient cultivators were really rich. There are at least tens of thousands of high-grade spirit stones here. The whole Immortal Palace is made of high-grade spirit stones. Presumably, high-grade spirit stones weren't rare in the Middle Ages. Qin Shi nodded in agreement. The next moment he said in surprise, Chinga, look. Mo Chinga turned around to take a look. She was also shocked. This is... In Qin Shi's hand lay several colorful, sparkling and translucent jades. Each piece was surrounded by spiritual aura visible to the naked eye and reflected rainbow-like colors. After looking for a while, she cried out involuntarily, Are these crystal jades? The appearance of these jades was very similar to the crystal soul jade she exchanged for in Kuanzhong City, but their quality was better. Each one was bright and sparkling without the slightest flaw. Crystal jades were a kind of jade that could store spirit stones in the Middle Ages. Genuine ones were called crystal jades, substandard ones were called crystal stones, and defective ones were called crystal soul jades. Compared with spirit stones, crystal jades not only contained a lot of spiritual aura, but their spiritual aura could also be slowly replenished after it was consumed. After the upheaval, crystal jades had almost disappeared. Even crystal soul jades could only be found by chance. Nowadays, if a cultivator obtained a crystal soul jade, they would usually embed it into a magic treasure. That way the magic treasure could automatically recover spiritual energy. Although it was slow, in a battle of magical powers, a little more spiritual energy could affect the outcome of the battle. The quality of the crystal jades in front of them was so good that their effects would definitely be 100 times better than the crystal soul jades. In the current world of cultivators, each of them would fetch a sky-high price. Most likely. Qin Shi poured out all the crystal jades he had. There were actually several hundred of them. Even though he had seen so many treasures, he still found it hard to breathe. After calming himself down, he said with a smile, although the resources of the ancient times are slightly inferior to those of the immemorial times, they still can't be underestimated. Their high-grade spirit stones can be used to build immortal palaces. I presume that the high-grade cultivators used crystal jades to trade. Mo Chinga pressed her hand on her chest to calm her breathing. She beamed with joy and said, Master Fu Yaozi was right. We really got rich overnight. After seeing so many crystal jades, the 2 of them were prepared to look at the other treasures, so they were no longer shocked. Soon after, the 2 of them found a jade slip among the miscellaneous items. The jade slip recorded a cultivation technique called Ice Heart Jade Bone Technique. Fu Yaozi guessed correctly. The bones of these ancient cultivators were crystal-like because of the Ice Heart Jade Bone Technique. This cultivation technique could only be practiced by cultivators with ice spiritual roots. It was the cultivation technique of the Ice Heart Jade Bone Technique, and only a few outstanding geniuses could practice it. After practicing this cultivation technique, the bones in the whole body would slowly change. By the time a cultivator reached the nascent soul realm, their bones would be as clear as crystal. At that time, the Ice Heart Jade Bone technique could be considered to have reached the initial stage and could increase one's chances of advancing to the deification realm. The two of them felt it was a pity. They didn't have ice spiritual roots, so they couldn't use this miraculous cultivation technique. In addition, there was also a jade slip related to the art of mechanisms. It was called Introduction to Mechanisms. Emo Chinga looked at it and was slightly disappointed. The art of mechanisms recorded in this jade slip was very simple. It seemed this ancient cultivator had just started studying the art of mechanisms and wasn't proficient in it. It was no wonder the mechanisms arranged in this cave weren't too brilliant. They were only made of rare materials and had great lethality. Once they finished looking, the two of them put everything back into their interspatial rings, including the white robe covering the corpse. As for the crystal bones, Fu Yaozi also told them to put them away. Emo Chinga hesitated. These bones were so special, so they must be useful. But they already took the remains of this ancient cultivator. If they didn't even let go of his remains, wouldn't that be a bit? As if he knew what she was thinking, Fu Yaozi said faintly, "It's just a bag of skin. What's there to care about? This ancient cultivator senior has already passed away. These bones have long had nothing to do with him." Emo Chinga knew she was sticking to the surface. She took a deep breath, excused herself, put the crystal bones into her bag, and also put them into her interspatial ring. After finishing these things and making sure she didn't miss anything, she left the cave with Qin Shi. After leaving this cave, the two of them went to the second cave without stopping. This time it was much simpler. This cave didn't have any art of mechanisms and only had some residual restrictions. It only took the two of them an hour to break the restrictions at the entrance. After entering the cave, they found that the furnishings inside were the same as before. There was nothing but a stone table and a stone chair. After Qin Shi broke the cultivation room, he didn't find any traces of restrictions. It was empty, no one was in closed-door meditation. Although the two of them were mentally prepared, they were still disappointed. Then they went to the third and last cave. "Something's wrong," Qin Shi said with a frown before breaking the restriction. "What's wrong?" Emo Chinga was laying formation flags, preparing to break the restriction. "There's a strange aura inside," Qin Shi said. "Be careful." Emo Chinga nodded. There was a gap in their realms. Qin Shi's divine sense was stronger than hers, so he was more sensitive to danger than her. After pondering for a moment, she arranged another restriction around the formation flag used to break the formation. The restriction-breaking formation was activated, and the light screen in front of the cave flashed. Qin Shi stepped forward, gathered his sword aura and hit the stone door. With a loud bang, the stone door was smashed into pieces, and a gust of black aura gushed out. "Be careful." Qin Shi pulled Emo Chinga and quickly retreated. "Primordial Devil Aura." Emo Chinga gasped. Without thinking, she reached into her sleeve and took out the Lotus Elemental Umbrella. Fortunately, she had set up an additional restriction earlier. The Primordial Devil Chi was blocked and not much of it leaked out. At this moment, the Lotus Dragon Umbrella was opened, and the fluorescent light sprinkled down, isolating the remaining Devil Chi outside. "Sword formation," she shouted, remembering what Fu Yaozi once told her. Qin Shi reacted very quickly. In an instant, he retrieved the 3-yang real fire sword into his body, dispersed the spiritual aura protecting his body, and used the art of rising and falling devil. Aside from the Lotus Elemental Umbrella, Emo Chinga also put away all her magic weapons. The two of them retreated for a long time before they breathed a sigh of relief. "What's going on?" Emo Chinga asked in bewilderment as they glanced at each other. "Maybe this cave is the point where the primordial devil aura leaked out," Qin Shi guessed. There was no other explanation. Emo Chinga hesitated. "Then do we still go in?" The primordial devil aura in this space was purer and more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. Moreover, it could backfire, so it was really difficult to deal with. Qin Shi glanced at her and asked, "What do you think?" Emo Chinga was about to say something, but the two of them suddenly felt a dangerous aura and vigilantly looked towards the entrance of the cave. They saw that the primordial devil aura at the open stone door was getting thicker and thicker, and a powerful momentum was pressing down on them, almost making it hard for them to breathe. "Deification stage," Qin Shi muttered. He was already in the middle stage of the nascent soul realm. He was sure that nascent soul cultivators couldn't have this kind of momentum, Not even late-stage nascent soul cultivators who were only a step away from the deification stage. Let's go. He made a prompt decision and suddenly grabbed Mo Tianga's hand. With a wave of his sleeve, he summoned his flying cloud and directly jumped down from the hardship cliff. When the two of them jumped down from the hardship cliff, Mo Tianga glanced at the entrance of the cave. From the corner of her eye, a completely charred and swaying refined corpse appeared. This refined corpse stopped at the entrance of the cave for a moment. With a wave of its hand, its sharp claws destroyed the formation she laid at the entrance. Soon after, it seemed to sense their aura and looked towards them. Mo Tianga was shocked. She roughly guessed what was going on. In this third cave, there was also a deification cultivator who was cultivating in closed-door meditation. When the space was torn, all the cultivators were killed, and this cultivator also died at this time. Later, there was a problem with the sacrificial temple under the Immortal Palace. Primordial devil aura leaked out, and this cave happened to be one of the points where the aura leaked out. There were restrictions both inside and outside the cave, so the primordial devil aura was sealed inside. As time passed, this cultivator's skeleton was corroded and turned into a refined corpse. The refined corpse had no consciousness and the cave was in a closed state. For a long time, this deification refined corpse just stayed in the cave, completely unaware of the changes outside. If they hadn't opened the cave, perhaps it would have remained silent like this, no different from a corpse. But today they opened the cave and it sensed the aura of living people. Thus, it finally stepped out of this cave and walked towards the world it was once familiar with. It fell from the top of the hardship cliff at an extremely fast speed. Just as it was about to hit the ground, the flying cloud suddenly stopped, changed direction, and fled into the distance at an extremely fast speed. The deification refined corpse also jumped down from the hardship cliff, but with a rumble, it fell heavily to the bottom of the cliff. The devil aura around its body surged because of this jump. After a while it finally condensed again. It stood up shakily and chased after them. It's behind us. Mo Tianga turned around to look. In this immortal palace, they couldn't use their divine sense freely, so they could only barely sense the powerful aura following behind them. Qin Shi's expression was solemn. He said calmly, "The refined corpse's speed is a weakness. If it's fast enough, we can escape." Then, with a clear sound, he spread out the sword formation again and circled around them. At the same time, he didn't hesitate to slap precious talismans on the two of them. Although there might be strange restrictions in this immortal palace because of the space being torn, they couldn't fly too fast, but they couldn't care less. A deification refined corpse, even if all the cultivators who entered the immortal palace joined forces, could be destroyed with a wave of their hand. They weren't its match at all. They had no other choice but to escape. Chapter 475. The fiery red flight light swept past the foot of the mountain, rushing toward the buildings of the immortal palace. On a lonely peak, progenitor Miaoying suddenly turned her head and looked at the flight light in surprise. Who is this fellow Taoist? How dare he fly in the immortal palace like this? Isn't he afraid of triggering some strange restriction? Traveling with her was a skinny old man in a tattered Taoist robe. He was Taoist Guo of Pufa school. Jingshu sect and Pufa sect could only be regarded as average among the major forces. Except for the two Grand Supreme Elders at the late nascent stage, the strength of the other nascent soul cultivators was average. When they entered the immortal palace, the other cultivators of the two sects were left outside, and only the two of them temporarily accompanied each other. Taoist Guo stroked his goatee. When he saw the black demonic aura behind the red flight light, he exclaimed, "Junior Martial Sister Miaoying, look! A demonic creature." The two of them looked at each other with strange expressions. Judging from the scene in front of them, the cultivator in the red flight light must be being chased by the demonic aura. The question was, what exactly was this demonic aura? The two of them had a smooth journey, but they hadn't seen any refined corpses. It didn't take long for them to find the answer. The red flight light flew so fast that the demonic aura gradually couldn't keep up. However, it sensed their breaths halfway, paused, then changed direction and flew toward them. Seeing this, progenitor Miaoying was shocked. "Senior Martial Brother Guo, look." The next moment, the surging breath almost soared into the sky. Taoist Guo's expression became even more unsightly. He flicked his horsetail whisk, a cloud appeared under his feet, and he was about to escape while shouting, "Run! It's a deification cultivator." But progenitor Miaoying looked at the half-broken ancient cultivator's cave with pity. If they could break this cave, they'd definitely get amazing fated chances. But she wasn't stupid. Sensing the demonic aura, she clenched her teeth, turned into a flight light, and chased after Taoist Gua. All fated chances were not as important as her life. She flew out of the ascetic cliff, flew past the peaks full of spiritual aura, and entered the building complex of the Immortal Palace. He didn't feel any aura anymore, so he stopped. He temporarily put away the flying cloud and landed in a garden. It didn't chase us? Still in a state of shock, Mo Chenga turned around to look. However, her divine sense was restricted in this place, so how far could she see with her eyes? Naturally, he didn't see anything. She wiped the sweat off his face and said, "He went to chase after someone else. Let's take a break first." When he was fleeing just now, he didn't hold back at all. He even used his blood essence to destroy his true essence. He flew without any scruples. When he encountered a restriction, he could only forcefully dissolve it. Now he didn't have much spiritual chi left. Chasing after someone else? Mo Chenga was dumbfounded for a moment. Her cultivation level was slightly lower, so her divine sense was more restricted. On the way here, she didn't notice anyone else at all. She swallowed a handful of restorative panaceas and said, "I sensed there were people in front of me, so I deliberately flew past them." Sure enough, that refined corpse couldn't distinguish between us and chased after those two people. Mo Chenga glanced at him but didn't say anything. Upon seeing her expression, she smiled. "What do you want to say?" Mo Chenga wrinkled her brows, but she couldn't help but laugh. "I really didn't know you could be so treacherous." She wore a smile on his face, but his gaze was indifferent. He didn't take it seriously. "Isn't this very normal? We can only escape by diverting the trouble to someone else. I'm not a saint either." Mo Chenga nodded. She didn't feel conflicted in her heart. If she were in his shoes, she might also make the same choice. "Alright, don't waste time. Let's quickly recover our spiritual aura," she said, then sat cross-legged on the spot to adjust his breath. Mo Chenga had been carried all the way here, so she didn't consume much spiritual aura. However, in this kind of situation, the more prepared, the better. Thus, she also sat cross-legged, adjusting her breath while thinking about countermeasures. A deification realm refined corpse appeared in this immortal palace. For the cultivators who entered the immortal palace, the treasure-seeking journey immediately became perilous. The higher the realm, the greater the gap between the two realms. The difference between the deification realm and the nascent soul realm was like heaven and earth, even between the early stage of the deification realm and the peak stage of the nascent soul realm. This deification realm refined corpse was naturally transformed by chance. Although it didn't have a consciousness, it was very likely that it retained its original body's habits in fights of magical powers. How could the divine abilities of the deification realm cultivators of the distant past era, who had already declined for more than 100,000 years, be a match for the cultivators of the cultivation world? Therefore, if they were caught by this deification realm refined corpse, no matter how powerful a nascent soul cultivator was, they could only die. However, since it was a refined corpse, its weakness was its clumsiness. If they discovered it early and avoided it, they wouldn't be in life-threatening danger. However, the problem was that with a deification realm refined corpse wandering around, the nascent soul cultivators wouldn't be at ease when searching for treasures. "Master?" Mo Chenga called Fu Yaozi softly after thinking for a while. However, Fu Yaozi didn't move for a long time. If she didn't feel the existence of the divine sense on the Fuxing sword, she would almost think he disappeared. Thinking about what Fu Yaozi said before, that his divine sense was a bit weak, Mo Chenga guessed that maybe he was resting? She couldn't help but sigh. That being the case, they could only think of a way themselves. She didn't really care about the other treasures in this immortal palace. Their original goal was to collect top-grade spiritual treasures in the storehouse. Now that there was a deification realm refined corpse wandering around in the immortal palace, there was no need to stay outside. There was an illusory formation in the storehouse. In the end, the refined corpse was just an idiot. It definitely couldn't see through the illusory formation. The storehouse was the safest place. But here came the problem. Although she knew the weakness of the illusory formation, she and Qinshi alone weren't enough to break it. When they left the storehouse, they agreed to meet up with Master Taoist Yuanmu and the others for a day. There was still half a day left. Did they have to hide for half a day? While Mo Chenga was pondering, the immortal palace was in a mess because of this deification realm refined corpse. Seeing Taoist Gua and primordial Lord Miaoying flying towards them at an unparalleled speed, Venerable Xuxiang's loud voice rang out. "Oh my fellow Taoists, where are you going?" Venerable Xuxiang really didn't have many friends. After entering the Immortal Palace, no one was willing to cooperate with him, so he could only wander around the Immortal Palace alone, looking for fated chances. Fortunately, he found the remains of several ancient cultivators and obtained several Chenkuan bags. However, the cultivation levels of these ancient cultivators weren't very high. Although there were several rare treasures in their Chenkuan bags, none of them were related to the deification realm. He had been stuck in the late stage of the nascent soul realm for so many years, but aside from fated chances related to the deification realm, there really wasn't anything else that caught his eye. He also found an ancient cultivator's immortals cave on a separate mountain peak that was obviously of a much higher level. Unfortunately, it was robbed by old man Yuan Mu, who relied on his superior numbers. Although Yuan Mu was noisy as a great cultivator in the late nascent soul realm, how could he be a fool? He was only one person and couldn't compete with Juyan's sect, so he could only endure it. However, since he didn't have any clear information or partners to cooperate with, he had no other choice but to rely on luck. Thus, he wandered around the Immortal Palace, hoping to find the medicinal garden of this great ancient cultivation group or a hidden ancient cultivator's cave to pick up one or two things related to the deification realm. As he wandered around, he suddenly saw two rays of light speeding towards him. There were a total of 11 late nascent soul realm cultivators in Yunzhong. These people were both competitors and fellow cultivators who appreciated each other. After hundreds and thousands of years, they were very familiar with each other. With just a glance, he knew that it was progenitor Miao Ying and Taoist Gua. Seeing the two of them, Venerable Void Phase was delighted. Although these two were not too close to him, they were much better than old fogies like Yuan Mu and Guifeng. Progenitor Miao Ying was famous for her good relations with others. She was always smiling at everyone and had a good relationship with him. Taoist Gua was also a turtle and was a good guy. Surely he wouldn't have any objections if he were to join them? If he had these two as partners, he would be able to show off his skills. Besides, Taoist Gua cultivated the Vajra body enhancement technique, and progenitor Miao Ying's strength was not in attack. As for him, his tiger taming technique was known for its tyrannical power, which just happened to make up for their shortcomings. They should not have any objections. With this thought in mind, Venerable Void Phase called out to the two of them. Hey, I'm calling you. Why are you running so fast? It's not like I'm going to eat you. Taoist Void Phase, who are you addressing as Lord Buddha? Hearing this, the two fleeting lights stopped. Progenitor Miao Ying glanced at Venerable Void Phase with a smile. Her usually dignified and amiable face now had a hint of murderous intent. Venerable Void Phase was annoyed that he had let slip. He smiled shamelessly and said, Junior Sister Miao Ying, this old monk has always been like this. I can't stop talking. I didn't mean to say that to you. Please don't take it to heart. If you didn't say that to Junior Sister Miao Ying, then you must have said it to me? Taoist Gua flicked his horsetail whisk and glanced at Venerable Void Phase with half-opened eyes. Venerable Void Phase blinked his large eyes and pretended to be innocent. Old man Gua, I just couldn't stop talking. You're not that petty, are you? Taoist Gua raised his eyes and ignored him. Although he was a good guy, he did not have a good temper with Venerable Void Phase. Venerable Void Phase had a favor to ask, so he could not be bothered to be calculative. He asked shamelessly, Junior Sister Miao Ying, Old man Gua, what are you doing? Why are you in such a hurry? Did you find some opportunity? Progenitor Miao Ying glanced at him with a half-smile. Fellow Taoist Void Phase, this opportunity. I don't think it's a good idea to tell others about it. Just say it. Venerable Void Phase was very anxious. He had been wandering around for more than a day and had yet to find any opportunity. Let's get straight to the point. Neither of you are good at attacking, so I can make up for your shortcomings. Bring me along. If there's an opportunity, I'm willing to let you choose first. Progenitor Miao Ying and Taoist Gua looked at each other and seemed to be discussing something. Turning around, they saw Venerable Void Phase looking at them eagerly. Progenitor Miao Ying smiled. Fellow Taoist Void Phase, it's not that we can't bring you along. But you said that if there's an opportunity, we'll choose first, right? Of course. Venerable Void Phase nodded repeatedly. Very well. We've indeed found an opportunity not far ahead. Wait here. We'll send word for you once we've confirmed it. What do you think? You're not trying to fool me, are you? If you don't believe me, then forget it. Progenitor Miao Ying pretended to leave. Wait. Venerable Void Phase quickly called out to them. Alright, I believe you. Progenitor Miao Ying revealed a dignified and friendly smile. Then please wait here, fellow Taoist Void Phase. Senior Brother Gua and I will send word soon. She glanced at Taoist Gua and the two of them turned into conveyance lights and flew away. Venerable Void Phase rubbed his bald head and shouted from behind, "You'd better send word quickly." The two conveyance lights disappeared among the mountains without looking back. After a while, Venerable Void Phase's angry roar could be heard. Meowing Old Man Gua. You two bastards. How dare you plot against me? You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.